Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. It was the summer of 2018. And I was in my early 20s, living in a small town that seemed stuck in time. My friends and I were always looking for new, exciting ways to occupy our days. And undoubtedly, curiosity got the better of us. We had heard rumors about an abandoned hotel on the outskirts of town, and thinking it might be interesting, or perhaps a bit scary, we decided to explore it. When routine becomes tedious, even something frightening seems more attractive than a night with nothing to do. Little did we imagine that this choice would lead us to an unforgettable night. The hotel had been empty for as long as I could remember. It was a huge, imposing structure located at the edge of a forest, slowly being reclaimed by nature. The plants around it had grown so much that finding an entrance was already a challenge. The stories about the hotel varied, but there was one common recommendation: never visit it after dark. But we were young and foolish, believing that the presence of the group would give us courage. We grabbed our flashlights and set off as the sun was setting. The fog was thick that night. I remember us gathered at the edge of the forest, my heart racing despite starting to have doubts. Everyone was so excited that I preferred not to be the one to dampen the mood. As we approached the hotel, our first impression was that it was just a strange building, probably less dangerous than everyone said. I even thought that perhaps it was just one of those scary stories our parents told to keep us away. The windows were all broken, and the main entrance was nothing more than a large hole. The walls covered in graffiti, and the overgrown bushes intensified the already eerie atmosphere that took hold of me as soon as we entered. We entered carefully, flashlights in hand, illuminating the path ahead. The lobby was crammed with old, torn furniture, while the faded wallpaper peeled off the walls in strips. We chatted about how it must have been when it was still functioning, and how strange it was to see everything left to rot. We started by exploring the ground floor, peering into dark rooms. My friends began inventing ghost stories to scare the group with each creak of the floorboards. But that only led to more laughter. As we climbed the stairs to the next floor, we found clear signs that we weren't the only ones exploring the place. Sleeping bags, empty food cans, and some belongings scattered about indicated that other people, probably homeless, used the building. This was uncomfortable, but not so surprising. After all, an abandoned place, far from the city and without police presence, was an obvious refuge for someone in that situation. We decided to continue climbing to the third floor, and then to the fourth. We knew the fourth floor had the reputation of being the scariest, so we didn't hesitate to go straight there. As we climbed, we noticed more and more damage to the building. The floorboards were in terrible condition, and the structure seemed more unstable with each step. We passed through the rooms carefully, attentive not to step wrongly, when a strange feeling invaded me, as if someone was watching us. I tried to ignore it, convinced it was just my imagination. In a place like this, anyone could feel the same. Finally, we reached the top floor and found an open door leading to a terrace on the roof. The view was impressive, but something seemed wrong. We fell silent and soon clearly heard a muffled conversation coming from one of the nearby rooms. My heart began to race, but we cautiously followed the sound. I started asking my friends to leave together, but they were determined to discover if there really was someone there. The door was just ajar, and we peeked carefully. 3 men were sitting around a small, almost collapsing table, and it was evident they were preparing to use some substance, though I wasn't exactly sure what. They looked at us, surprised, and for an instant we all froze. My friend Alex took a step forward, trying to start a conversation. He explained we were just there to explore the building, but received only silence in response, and the tension in the air seemed to increase with each second. Then one of the men finally broke the silence with a harsh, hostile voice, saying, "You shouldn't have come here." That phrase sent a chill down my spine. I realized we had gotten into something dangerous, a situation far beyond what we could control. For them, this was their space, their home, and in reality, we were the intruders. Another of the men seemed even more agitated. He pulled out a knife and began walking toward Alex. Fortunately, Alex managed to step back in time, avoiding the blow. But soon the other 2 men stood up to support their friend. Alex shouted for us to run, and we didn't hesitate to dash down the stairs with the old wood crumbling under our feet as we tried to escape. Alex was last, but the 3 men were right behind. When we were almost at the ground floor, Alex tripped and fell down a flight of stairs. I watched in horror as he fell and landed with a thud on the lobby floor. He seemed to be unconscious, and we all started screaming. His girlfriend, Bate, ran to him while the rest of us looked at the men, without knowing what would happen next. My mind screamed that this would be our last night. I looked at the men, not knowing what was to come. "I hope your friend isn't dead. We didn't want to hurt you for real, just scare you. We do this with all these young people who show up here," said one of them as he put away the knife he had been brandishing earlier. "We just wanted to make sure no one would come back. That's all. Take your friend, go away, and call for help. I'm very sorry. Just don't send anyone back here again, okay?" In the dim light we had, I could see the fear in their eyes. It became clear they were telling the truth and really didn't intend to hurt us. It was one of those moments when you end up in the wrong place at the wrong time. In the end, the fault was ours. We should have avoided that place from the beginning. As the 3 men went back up the stairs, I looked at Alex, who had his head in Bates' lap. She was begging him to wake up, and we realized no one had a cell phone signal there. We quickly understood we would need to carry him to the car. Fortunately, it wasn't too far, just to the entrance of the forest. But we were still about an hour away from the nearest hospital. There was no other option. The journey was tense. Alex remained unconscious the entire way. But finally, we arrived at the hospital. The doctors took him immediately, and we discovered he had suffered a cerebral hemorrhage. When he woke up about a week later, he realized he could no longer feel the lower part of his body and was permanently paralyzed from the waist down. Bate insisted we report what happened to the police. She was outraged by the irreversible consequences Alex would have to face. After talking it over, we decided to leave the decision in his hands, and being the generous and selfless guy he always was, Alex chose not to report them. He said it would only destroy their lives. and it was enough that he had to deal with a completely transformed life. He knew they never intended to hurt him. Alex was discharged a few weeks later from the hospital and faced great challenges, adapting to his new reality. He and Bate decided to end their relationship shortly thereafter. She never fully understood why he refused to report the men to the police, and it seems this difference of opinion was the main reason for their breakup. However, even after the breakup, she respected his decision and kept silent about what happened. It's been just over 11 years, and our friendship with the group has changed. Some of us are no longer as close, but Alex and I ended up falling in love and getting married. Bate is still part of our lives, although the bond has weakened over time. Alex refuses to let his disability define his trajectory. That night truly transformed our lives forever. But as strange as it may seem, a part of me feels gratitude for everything that happened. After all, if it hadn't been that way, perhaps we would never be together. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. Working at a hotel isn't exactly a glamorous dream, in fact. It's far from it. But when I needed a job, a position opened up at the town's hotel, and I was hired on the spot. I was 18, fresh out of high school, and had decided not to go to college because I was in the phase of challenging everything my parents wanted for me. Of course, I know that no one is obligated to attend college to be successful, but in my case, it's hard not to think that maybe I should have gone. Maybe then I would have avoided the difficult things this job brought into my life. In the first few months, I faced uncomfortable situations, unpleasant men throwing crude pickup lines, asking how much it would cost for me to join them at night. Then came the physically repulsive things. I worked at the front desk, but with the constant staff shortage, I ended up doing cleaning for about a month. And I must say, it was a truly frightening experience. At some point, I encountered practically all bodily fluids in almost every corner of a room. It reached a point where I had to tell my manager that I would quit if I had to clean another room. He assured me that it wouldn't be necessary anymore, and that my work would be smooth from then on. So one time, around 2:30 in the morning, amid an intense snowstorm, no one had checked in for hours. I imagined the rest of the night would be calm, maybe even silent. But suddenly, I heard the door open and the bell ring loudly. 2 guys entered, wearing heavy coats and knocking the snow off their boots by stamping them on the floor. They were laughing about something, but immediately stopped when they saw me sitting at reception. Their smiles vanished. They exchanged strange looks and walked slowly to the counter. I adjusted my customer service smile, that fake smile, and tried to appear as friendly and helpful as possible, although I was exhausted and feared it would show through. They had no reservation, so I made one for them, a standard room with 2 queen beds. Up to that point, everything seemed normal, but as they walked away, I heard one of them comment on how pretty they found me. I had just turned 18 and imagined this would be something I'd have to get used to. So I ignored it and continued with my night. I was reading a book when I heard footsteps in the lobby again. It was one of the men from before. He approached the reception and leaned over the counter, getting much closer than I would have liked. He smelled of beer and cigarettes. I asked if there was anything I could help him with, hoping it would be something quick and that he would soon return to his room. But of course, life is rarely that simple. He complained that the shower drain was clogged in their room and that he needed someone to fix it immediately. I tried calling maintenance, but as expected, no one answered. I explained to the man, with all the gentleness possible, that the repair could only be done the next morning. He began to lose his patience, threatening to complain to the manager and leave negative reviews. When he really started shouting, I decided it would be easier to check personally than to deal with him waking up the other guests, which would bring more complaints and could even cost me my job. I admit that entering a room alone with two men wasn't the wisest decision, but at that moment, I was exhausted and just wanted him to stop shouting, a choice I would unfortunately regret forever. He led me to the room, and I asked him and his friend to wait outside while I checked the shower drain. They agreed, and everything seemed normal at first. I leaned over the bathtub and opened the faucet. The water was draining normally. I shouted to let them know it was working fine, and that's when I heard the door slam behind me. I turned quickly and was startled to see the larger of the two inside the bathroom with me. He grabbed me by the shoulders and pushed me against the wall. "Stay quiet, or this is going to be much worse than it needs to be," he said, almost laughing. I screamed as loud as I could, hoping some guest would hear. He released one of his hands to cover my mouth with the other. With one of my arms free, I did something he certainly didn't expect. I pulled out my concealed gun, aimed at his side, and pulled the trigger without hesitation. The noise made my ears ring intensely. He let me go and fell to the floor. With the adrenaline rushing, I barely noticed when the other man entered the bathroom. I pointed the gun at him and ordered him to get out, or I would shoot. He saw his friend bleeding at my feet and understood I wasn't bluffing. Without saying a word, he ran out of the room faster than I could have imagined. I stepped over the fallen man. I didn't know if he was alive or dead, but I needed to get out of there. I walked down the hallway, leaving bloody footprints behind me. I must have stepped in his blood when I passed by him. Several guests were in the hallway, wanting to know what had happened and where the sound of a gunshot came from. A woman from the room next door seemed to notice my state and immediately came to make sure I was okay. The police arrived shortly after, and the room was isolated. The man was taken to the hospital and, surprisingly, wasn't dead and survived the wound. An investigation was opened, but fortunately, the security cameras clearly showed I was lured to the room by the two men, and that they returned after I asked them to stay in the hallway. The audio captured everything clearly, and I was never charged with anything related to the shooting. The other man was found a few miles away. His truck had gotten stuck in a snowdrift. Both were charged with kidnapping, and the man who cornered me in the bathroom also faced assault charges. They were sentenced to 3 years in prison and forbidden from contacting me after their release. Shortly after, I quit and decided to enroll in college. Today, I study English with the dream of entering the writing field, and that's why I share this account, which was incredibly liberating. If I can leave one piece of advice for anyone in this scary world we live in, it would be this: learn to protect yourself. It might one day save your life. I feel compelled to share an experience that has disturbed the peace I found in my special sanctuary these past few years. I'm a 32-year-old woman who, for about 4 years now, has been exploring a beautiful wooded trail near my home in the Green Mountains of Vermont. This path has been my favorite escape, with its serene waterfalls and meadows that look like they've been lifted straight out of a fairy tale. However, over time, I've had some rather frightening encounters. Thankfully, during these adventures, I've always had the company of Odin, my loyal 90-pound Bernese mountain dog. He's the sweetest creature imaginable, but possesses a protective instinct that never fails. The first of these encounters happened 4 years ago, in the dead of autumn. I was climbing a steep hill when suddenly Odin began to growl in a way I'd never heard before. I looked around and spotted a man hidden in the shadows of the trees, watching us. As soon as I noticed him, he began slowly walking in our direction, his face obscured by a hood. I tried to be cordial, saying hello as I usually would to fellow hikers, but he didn't respond. I decided to continue walking, but soon felt I should head back. When I turned around, I realized the man had also changed direction. He was standing in the middle of the hill, a place where normally nobody stops. When he saw me turn back, he stepped into the forest, hugging a tree and staring fixedly at the valley below. Nothing overtly threatening, but the situation had an unsettling quality to it. About a year later, around the same season, Odin and I were on the trail again when he suddenly started growling once more. I should mention that Odin is extremely sociable. He loves meeting people and exploring whatever he finds along the path. This time I saw it was the same man, standing in the shadows, watching us. I thought perhaps Odin had frightened him previously, and he was waiting for us to cross the bridge before continuing. After all, he could have simply continued along the trail instead of standing there motionless. We crossed the bridge and continued our walk, but once again, I felt that intuition that I should look behind me. When I did, I realized the man was following us. He didn't need to wait for the bridge to cross. Odin and I sat down beside the trail. I took out my phone, making it clear I'd noticed his presence without directly confronting him. I just cast occasional glances in his direction. He stopped as soon as I turned around, despite me being off the path and not blocking his way. However, after I took out my phone, he finally walked past. When I started heading back, I came across a large branch that he had left behind, which had been sharpened with a knife into an improvised spear. I picked up that makeshift weapon and continued onward, keeping my eyes alert to my surroundings. Looking back now, I should have reported it immediately, but I convinced myself I was overreacting or being paranoid. Approximately a year later, in autumn, I decided to walk the same path again. It might seem foolish, but I'd stayed away for an entire year and had convinced myself I was just being neurotic. Snow covered the nearly deserted trail, and at a certain point, I noticed a series of sad faces carved into the snow on the trees. I didn't see anyone nearby, but Odin began growling at something in the forest that I couldn't see. So we turned back. Still, I didn't report it, convinced no one would take my account seriously. Today, several months after the last incident, I was on the trail again when I spotted a tree with the words, "I see you," written in chalk. A feeling of unease washed over me. I turned around and this time went straight to the park rangers and the police. There's no update yet, but I'm cooperating with the rangers to keep the area monitored. After sharing these events in my hiking groups on Facebook, I received support from several women who had experienced similar encounters in the same location. One recounted being followed in the middle of July by a man wearing a full snowsuit. Another reported being followed to her car, with the same man appearing between the trees at different points along the path, watching her. To those calling me naive or reckless for returning to my favorite trail after waiting a year, those criticisms don't help. That's victim blaming, and I don't need it. I'm listening to recommendations to avoid the area, but being belittled is unnecessary. Trust me, I'm already frightened enough. Update: 6 different women have come forward with similar accounts about a man of similar appearance in the same park. All have filed reports with the rangers. Recently, I gave an interview to local media. They approached me, and now the story is spreading. The rangers weren't very pleased with the fact that I went public with everything. But to me, it's important that people know what's happening. Unfortunately, someone erased the "I see you" message before the news team could document it, and there had been some rain as well. Even so, 3 women who don't know each other have messaged me, all believing the subject is the same person. They described him as unstable and said he spends most of his time in this park. Even his cousin reported him, and I provided his name and photo to the rangers. It appears the suspect is a former ranger of the park itself. Now we wait. Oh, and apparently, the man loves climbing trees and has several photos of himself at the top, about 50 feet high, which makes sense. He was probably hidden in the trees watching us, and it was he who left that message. Final update. Apparently, he has a secret camp in the forest where he keeps a chainsaw and gasoline. We informed the rangers about this. I'm certain that having an illegal camp in a public park is against the law, with or without a chainsaw, and that stalking and intimidation are forms of assault. So I see no reason why he can't at least be questioned. My name is Eliza, and I'm from Sacramento, California. I'd like to share this unsettling experience from my college days while studying at Redwood University. During that time, I worked morning shifts at a gas station on days when I had afternoon classes. I would wake up at 5, start my shift at 6, and stay until noon. After that, I'd catch the bus to the university to make it to my 1 o'clock classes. It was a job I genuinely enjoyed. After the initial morning rush, the last 3 hours or so were generally quiet, and if the boss wasn't around, I could relax in the office and read a book while waiting for customers. One Tuesday morning, a man who appeared to be in his early 50s walked into the station. He immediately caught my attention because when I looked up from my book, I thought I was looking at a ghostly version of David Bowie. My mother, who passed away years ago, was a huge Bowie fan, and I always admired her collection of old records as a child. I was fascinated by Bowie's face. He was a strikingly handsome man in his prime. But the man who entered that day looked like a shadowy version of Bowie. He had the same dark, curly hair and deep, tired eyes, but with even more pronounced features and a skeletal body, as if he were just skin stretched over bones. His clothes also seemed from another era. He wore a sheepskin coat, a bright purple shirt, and something resembling blue bell-bottom jeans. It might have been a stylish vintage look if it wasn't so worn out. Instead of a cool retro vibe, he just seemed out of place, unkempt, and to be honest, rather frightening. I generally didn't care about customers' appearances. After all, it was a gas station, not a nightclub. So even if Dracula himself walked in with sharp fangs and a flowing cape, I wouldn't say anything as long as he paid for his gas and left. Being honest, that day I would have preferred it was Dracula in person instead of this stranger, who seemed like Bowie's dark twin. He picked up a quart of milk from the refrigerated section, approached the counter, and asked for a specific amount of fuel for a particular pump. I took his money, gave him his change, and thanked him for his business. Most times a guy would just say, "Thanks, hun," and leave. But Dark Bowie stood there at the counter, staring at me and said, "You're a very pretty young lady, aren't you?" To say this gave me chills would be an understatement. I'm not good with compliments, I admit, but when they come with that viscous, threatening tone like his, they truly make me uncomfortable. It wasn't a quick compliment thrown while he was leaving. He elongated the word very before pretty, making it clear how uncomfortable he intended to make me feel. "You're a very pretty young lady, aren't you?" And the "aren't you" came out in an almost childish, high-pitched tone, as if he were talking to a child. I understood there was an age difference between us, but I was an adult woman, not a child. Still, I knew responding to this type of stranger wasn't worth the risk. Instead of responding directly, I maintained my politeness and just said thank you in a rather reserved way, and took a few steps to the side, pretending I needed to get something from the stockroom. It was a trick I used occasionally, that way of saying, "I'd love to chat, but work calls." And almost always the guys trying to flirt would get the message and return to their cars. But in Dark Bowie's case, as soon as I turned my back, he immediately asked, "Where are you going?" I turned around with the best smile I could muster, ready to give the classic excuse that I needed to go to the stockroom to continue inventory. But before I could speak, he snapped, "Don't turn your back on me when I'm trying to talk to you." There was a hint of aggression in his voice, just enough for me to think, oh no, this guy is going to be trouble. I began explaining very politely that I really needed to get back to work, saying something like, "I'm on the clock." He, however, retorted quickly, "Well, I'm a customer," and then started saying he didn't get many opportunities to talk to a girl as pretty as me, and he wanted to make the most of it. I tried to be polite and said that, while I appreciated the compliment, I'd get in trouble with my boss if I didn't do my tasks. But Dark Bowie simply ignored that and responded, "I'll handle your boss if he complains." Just as I was about to respond, he said something that left me even more disconcerted. "I wish I was as pretty as you." Some might think I'm exaggerating or repeating the word pretty needlessly, but I'm only reporting exactly what he said to me. It's not an attempt at false modesty or anything like that. Besides, I've always been terrible at handling compliments, but hearing a grown man say, "I wish I was as pretty as you," in such a clingy and repulsive way, was a new level of discomfort for me. My only reaction was to say something about how this type of comment was inappropriate in a work environment, and that even if he intended it as a compliment, I really didn't appreciate him commenting on my appearance. The guy let out a short laugh, almost a grunt, and asked, "You don't like being pretty?" For the first time, I couldn't think of any response, neither professional nor sincere. My only desire was to run to the stockroom, slam the door, and kick some cardboard boxes while pretending they were Dark Bowie. But the fear that he might follow me made me hold back. Instead, I tried to maintain my composure, repeating that I didn't like his tone and questions, and said I would call the police if he didn't leave. His aggression intensified a bit, and he asked incredulously, "You're really going to call the police just because someone called you pretty? Are you kidding?" I preferred not to respond and again asked him to leave, reinforcing it with a thank you to make it clear the discussion was over. The argument continued for a while longer, with him insisting he was a customer and wouldn't leave. But when I picked up my phone, signaling that I was really going to call emergency services, he said, "You know, if I were you, I'd stay home all day naked, just looking at myself in the mirror." To this day, that's one of the most frightening and disgusting things I've ever heard from someone. I was so furious I almost screamed, but I made every effort to stay calm and asked him again to leave. Dark Bowie then started saying I needed to learn to accept compliments, and commented that he would love to receive half the attention I received. I found it a strange comment coming from someone who didn't even know me. I continued insisting he leave, hoping he would eventually give up, but he wouldn't stop. Next, he began saying I would be depressed when I got older and lost my beauty. He said when that happened, I would be nothing but a pathetic, undesirable waste of oxygen, and that I would end up putting my head in an oven. This guy was completely out of his mind, and that last comment really brought me close to exploding and screaming at him. But instead, I gritted my teeth and repeated for the 1,000th time that he needed to leave. That's when he dropped the line, "If you don't want attention, if you don't like being pretty, then I can make you not so pretty if you want." The threat left me speechless, but not paralyzed. A second after he said it, I grabbed my phone and called the police. He gave a fake, indignant little laugh, but soon his voice changed completely, going from a mocking tone to a guttural growl. He said if my problem was being pretty, he could simply jump over the counter and destroy my face until I no longer looked like a person. He said when he was finished, neither friends nor family would recognize me, and I could forget about any stranger calling me pretty because I would be as hideous on the outside as he thought I was on the inside. When the call to the police was answered, there was a tremor in my voice as I tried to explain to the operator what was happening. Honestly, it was one of the most stressful experiences I've ever had because, at the same time, I was watching Dark Bowie to make sure he didn't jump over the counter, and trying to block out all the barbarities he continued to say. I needed to concentrate on giving all the correct information to the police. It was a total overload for me. The more stressed I became, the more distressed I felt. I remember him saying something like, "I would love to cut your face and use it. I would look at myself in the mirror masturbating, wearing your underwear, and pretend to be you." After I heard all this, the operator informed me that the police were on their way, and that's when I lost control. I started screaming at that guy, telling him the police were coming, that he would be arrested if he didn't get out of there while he still had the chance. Only then did he start heading toward the door. While leaving, He continued to spew threats about how he would return the next day to teach me good manners, and several other things that, thankfully, he never fulfilled. The police arrived within minutes. I showed them the security camera footage, and as soon as the officers saw it, one of them recognized the man who had harassed me. He told me the man's name was Marcus, but that he sometimes introduced himself as Vincent. I explained that he hadn't introduced himself to me, just became aggressive when I didn't react to his compliment the way he expected. One of the officers mentioned that Marcus did this frequently. The local police had already received several reports about his behavior of harassing women alone, especially those who were working, and couldn't simply walk away. It was like his trademark, and according to one of the officers, he was weeks away from being arrested and charged. They were waiting for the green light from the DA's office, but when it came, Marcus would probably get at least a few months in prison. I couldn't have asked for a better outcome, and I believe they fulfilled what they said, as I never saw that Marcus again, neither at the station nor anywhere else in town. I don't know his full name to look up and find out how much time he got, if any. But the fact that I never saw him around again was a good sign that he finally got what he deserved. I was enjoying a vacation with my family in Miami Beach when I was 14 years old when all of this happened. I was at the resort pool where there was a swim-up bar. I was chatting casually with a group of Australians, almost all young men, though I vaguely remember a woman with them. I started drinking with them, even though the legal age was 21. One of the guys gave me an extra wristband they had, since apparently they were leaving the resort that day, and decided to pass it on to someone. My parents had no idea about this, nor did they know I was drinking. These Australians were visibly much older, and they kept refilling my glass, drink after drink. I felt excited because, after all, I was getting drunk in a pool in Miami Beach, far from my mother's watchful eyes. At some point, they started convincing me that one of the guys in the group was 16, and that I should talk to him because, according to them, he was interested in me. But even at that age, I knew he was clearly not 16. He looked younger than the others, who appeared to be in their 30s, but maybe he was in his early 20s. In my naivety, I thought they were just teasing me. They kept insisting that he liked me and that we should go out together. I laughed at first, but the suggestion was repeated. It's worth noting that the whole time, my father was in the same pool, talking to a friend, keeping an eye on me from time to time. My parents are very strict. He had no idea what I was drinking contained alcohol, and the pool was large enough that he couldn't hear what was being said. By that point, I was completely drunk. It was my first experience getting really intoxicated. I don't remember leaving the pool while this guy insisted he was 16, but somehow my reckless self went along, as I remember thinking he was handsome. The resort was gigantic, and to this day, I don't understand how I can't remember crossing the property. I'm curious to know what we talked about. The next memory I have is walking toward a bus stop that was about 15 minutes from the resort. I know it was 15 minutes because my family, and I used to go there to explore Miami Beach. It was at this moment that he complimented me, saying I had a beautiful body, and asked if I had any intimate experiences. I just started laughing while he sat down on the bench at the stop and pulled me onto his lap. At this point, my head was spinning so much that I didn't protest, though I recall thinking I'd rather be back at the pool. And that's when the unexpected happened. I threw up on him. Since I was on his lap, the vomit went straight into his face and chest. And I just continued in an exorcist style, with that continuous stream. He was absolutely horrified, but I don't remember much of what was said. I just know we went back to the resort, and I never saw him again. I remember feeling extremely embarrassed, which looking back seems a bit exaggerated. I staggered back to the pool area, still covered in vomit, where my mother had already called the police, and she and my father were in total despair. My mother's high-pitched voice brought me back to reality in an instant, so I remember these moments more clearly, even if a bit jumbled. When they realized how drunk I was, they demanded an explanation of what had happened. I told the story, and both were furious. My mother was determined to find that young man or his friends, but everyone had already disappeared from the pool. At the time, I really didn't understand why there was so much concern and why she wanted to find them. To this day, I sometimes find myself thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't thrown up and had actually gone out with him. I was only 14 and 5'2", while he was at least a foot taller and undoubtedly of legal age. I remember that when he approached and we were alone, even in my extreme state of intoxication, I began to feel a certain discomfort. My parents ended up taking me back to the hotel room, where I spent hours in the bathtub, still vomiting. My mother was furious, full of indignation. To be honest, this didn't surprise me much, as she used to yell at me for smaller things. What really shocked me was my father's reaction, who was also angry. He was always so calm and honestly might have even found it a little funny that I had drunk and ended up that way. Not in a cruel way, but he would probably have seen it as an inevitable lesson about alcohol, something we all end up learning one day. He had actually told me something like that sometime before this whole trip. But now I understand that his anger wasn't directed at me. In fact, he was cursing at the guy. I was still in the bathtub, vomiting, while my parents moved to the kitchen area to talk away from me. Even from there, I could hear my father cursing while talking to my mother in our native language, which really scared me. I was in a state where I could barely stay conscious, drifting in and out of reality. But I remember feeling less scared and more sad, thinking I had disappointed him. He never got angry with me like that. But over time, I realized his irritation wasn't with me, or the fact that I had been drinking. It was anger because of that creep. At the time, I wondered why they were making such a big deal. I only understood the severity of the situation years later. Later that same day, all this happened around 2 in the afternoon, so I was a bit more conscious by dinner time. I expected my mother to explode at me during the meal, now that I was sober, as she usually does. She's like a fuse, always ready to ignite. But that night, both were strangely quiet, watching me and not leaving my side. Today, I imagine what must have gone through their heads, aware of the danger I had passed through just a few hours earlier, looking at me as if it were a miracle I was there. In my youth and foolishness, perhaps, but I feel a profound gratitude to the beer for irritating my stomach so much that it made me vomit in that life-saving way. This happened in late summer of 2022, around the end of August. On one of those nights, 3 friends of mine, Jason, Mike, and Dylan, and I decided to meet at a park in Dylan's neighborhood around midnight for one of our endless smoke sessions in the car. It was our last year of high school, and with the pandemic finally fading and all the political tension that was happening at the time, like many other young people, we ended up spending most of our time at home, attending online classes and barely going out since almost everything was still restricted. Because of this, we all started smoking weed to kill time and distract ourselves a bit. These car sessions had been our routine since June that year. Actually, I recently quit smoking completely for other reasons. But anyway, after about an hour of sessioning, the 4 of us reluctantly agreed to take a drive around the city with Dylan at the wheel, Jason in the front passenger seat, and Mike and I in the back. I know it was somewhat irresponsible. About 20 minutes later, still somewhat altered, and with the windows cracked open, we decided to play the soundtrack from Silent Hill to, get some laughs. As we left the residential area and took a main 2-way road that led to the more remote parts of the city, the scenery changed. We were passing through one of those suburban neighborhoods that sit kind of lost in the middle of nowhere. For those who live in the rural Midwest or Pacific Northwest, you can well imagine the type of place, everything completely dark, and us practically in the middle of nowhere, listening to spine-chilling ambient music. As we approached a poorly lit intersection, the atmosphere began to feel sinister, perfect for the time of year. As we neared the intersection, my mind began to wander, imagining what might be hidden in the darkness around us. I thought to myself, imagine if we ran into a creature like a Wendigo or something. That would be terrifying. Just as we reached the intersection and I looked to the left, I immediately spotted a figure emerging from the darkness. When she entered the area illuminated by the streetlight, I realized it was a woman with braids, impeccably and elegantly dressed, wearing a beige blouse and high heels. Immediately, I felt a chill. Something told me this wasn't right. After all, who would be there at 1 in the morning, so dressed up in the middle of nowhere? In the blink of an eye, my apprehension turned to reality when I saw this woman beginning to come toward us. I didn't want anyone to risk anything with her. I started getting nervous and told Dylan, "There's a woman coming toward us. Turn around now." Meanwhile, Jason noticed a second figure dressed in black emerging slowly from behind the car, about 15 feet away on our right side, also approaching. This only increased our fear even more. Mike, upon realizing the situation, saw the woman practically running toward us and shouting, "Hey, help me please, stop." Mike, in panic, began slapping Dylan's shoulder, yelling, "Man, turn around now." Now, Dylan, still somewhat affected by the weed, was lost for a moment before realizing that woman and the figure, now visibly a man, were just a few yards from the car. In panic, he blurted, "Oh man," and quickly turned the car to the right, fleeing in the opposite direction from where the woman and man were running. We all got a bit sobered up in that moment, frightened and confused by what had just happened. But we ended up laughing, perhaps still affected by what we had smoked. Of course, we couldn't stop wondering why that woman was running and shouting that way, and what that man dressed in black standing behind the car wanted from us. My morbid curiosity sometimes dominates me, and I confess that I would love to hear some theories about what could have happened to us that night. Was she genuinely in danger? Or was it an elaborate trap set up to rob or harm us? What was the story behind that well-dressed woman and the shadowy figure at a deserted intersection in the middle of the night? I guess we'll never know. But sometimes I still think about her face illuminated by that single streetlight and wonder what her fate was after we drove away. Almost 3 years ago, I was 17 years old and already more than familiar with difficult situations. My only company was my mother, but she faced her own problems, which prevented her from keeping a job for long. Throughout my childhood, we moved frequently, alternating between shared housing with roommates and never managing to establish a true home. Only on 2 brief occasions did we have something that seemed like our own. Many times we were forced to adapt to new environments overnight. So when I turned 17 and we again found ourselves on the verge of homelessness, I was almost used to it. I had spent more nights on the streets than I cared to remember. The day came when we had to leave the house, where we shared space with another person. My mother received an offer to stay in her boyfriend's apartment, but there was no place for me. By that time, I had already distanced myself from my friends, realizing they were hurting my mental health and well-being. My mother suggested I stay with her, but I refused. I felt it would be awkward to put myself between her and her boyfriend, and in some way, I was already accustomed to life on the streets. So I found myself at a Wendy's, eating some burgers before facing the night. When the sun set and darkness took over, I began looking for a place to sleep. I passed through various locations that night, trying to find some peace, but none seemed suitable. Either the environment was too hot, too bright, or I was attacked by mosquitoes. That's when I remembered a house where I used to go to relax. It was under construction and almost finished, with all doors locked and windows installed, which kept the mosquitoes outside. I entered through the back as I always did and went up the stairs. I ended up settling in the bathroom, where the floor was less dirty. I lay there trying to sleep until I began to hear sounds coming from downstairs. At first, I ignored them, thinking it could be the door through which I had entered earlier, opening and closing with the wind. Even when the noises continued, I didn't pay much attention. After about an hour, still unable to sleep, I decided to go out and sit on the back porch. I went down the stairs and out through the back door, settling on the porch. I was fiddling with my phone for about 5 minutes until something caught my attention. I saw movement to my left, just beyond the door I had exited. When I turned to look, it seemed like time had stopped. At first, I thought it was just an illusion, but I was wrong. There was a man immersed in darkness, peering from behind the wall, observing me. The lower part of his body was hidden, so that I could only see from the waist up. He leaned slightly to the left, as if wanting to avoid me seeing his entire body. His figure was just a silhouette, completely black, with no features I could identify. I stared at him for what seemed like an eternity, but he didn't move. I waited for him to approach and say something, since I normally talk to other homeless people, and imagined he was one of them. However, he remained completely still, in absolute silence. Perhaps if I hadn't noticed his presence, he would have continued there, watching me. Eventually, I stood up, grabbed my bike, and left the property. As I exited the yard, I looked through the window next to the door where I had seen the man before. In the moonlight, I realized he was still there, watching me leave. I could see the top of his head and his left eye, but he remained shrouded in shadows. He was a tall man with pale skin wearing some kind of jacket, but I couldn't distinguish many details. After witnessing that, I hurried to leave. I reached the front of the house, looked inside, but he was no longer anywhere to be seen. I got on my bike, gave one last farewell nod to the house, still with the feeling that he continued to watch me, and then pedaled away. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night, even trying to rest in 2 different places. And so ends my story. I didn't experience a dramatic chase or a desperate escape. After all, this was real life, not a movie or a book. I'll never know what that man was doing there, but I imagine that he, like me, was just looking for shelter. However, the way he stared at me was deeply unsettling. I keep thinking about how long he had already been there, and what could have happened if I had fallen asleep in that house. Would he have continued to watch me without me noticing? Or did his intentions go beyond that? I'll never know, but after this experience, I decided I would never enter a house like that again. The thought of being watched while I slept was more terrifying than any ghost story I'd ever heard. I was helping clean up the vacant lot next door after a group of homeless people had moved to another location when a city worker appeared. He came straight up to me, thanking me for the help, and then I directed him to another woman who was leading the cleanup efforts. He talked with her to arrange a time for collecting the bags, and then returned to speak with me, mentioning that we're neighbors. He commented that he lives in an irregular apartment that's partially visible from my backyard, and that he had noticed me for some time. Some of the other neighbors were listening attentively and began showing him where near their houses we were leaving the trash bags. "Oh, you live around here too," said these neighbors. "They live one house away from mine and have been here for more than 7 years, while I've only been here for 2. The next day, the bags weren't collected, which ended up attracting people to rummage through the trash and spread more garbage. Fortunately, the city made the collection the following day during the normal routine. Then this same worker showed up at my door, saying that the community organizer, which wasn't me, needed to have called the city to confirm the collection, but that he himself had resolved the issue. The truth is that the organizer knew she should call, but didn't because the worker was in uniform, and assured her everything was under control. He offered to help, but it seemed like he was making an excuse to come talk to me. When he finally turned to leave, I started chatting with the landlord of the house next door, who was doing some repairs nearby. However, the worker didn't really leave. He just stood there on the sidewalk, watching everything. There's something about him that feels like a huge red flag, and even the neighbors noticed it. I think I'm going to stop wearing tank tops and strapless tops in my backyard. I've noticed him watching my house at odd hours, and yesterday I could swear I saw him taking pictures from his apartment window. I've already told my roommate about it, and we're thinking about installing security cameras. What makes it all the more unsettling is that after checking with the city's public works department, I learned that they don't have any employee matching his description working in our district. So who is this man? And why is he pretending to be a city worker? I've started documenting every encounter, just in case I need to file a police report. The way he looks at me makes my skin crawl, and I can't shake the feeling that his interest isn't just neighborly curiosity. I worked the night shift at a gas station called Lone Star, about 20 miles outside a small town named Pinewood in rural Oregon. I'd leave my apartment in Riverdale and arrive there around 10 at night, starting my shift that lasted until 6 in the morning, when my boss, a guy named Hank, would show up to relieve me. Hank lived right next to the gas station, in a huge house that he always said he built himself. It was hard to believe he had done all that alone, but he was such a good guy that I never dared to question him. So I just agreed and let it go. Hank wasn't just a good boss, he was truly someone special. I say this with sincerity, because not everyone can say they had a boss willing to do almost anything to ensure the safety of his team. This makes me feel a bit guilty for not visiting him more often, but the truth is that I avoid passing through Pinewood. I don't like going anywhere near there, and by the end of this story, you might understand why. I worked at Lone Star for exactly 9 months and 3 weeks, usually 2 to 5 nights a week, depending on how things were going at college. During all the time I was there, I didn't have a single customer who caused me problems. In many ways, it was one of the best jobs I've ever had. On weekends, business would pick up a bit, but on weeknights, sometimes just 2 or 3 customers would come in, and I'd spend the rest of the time watching movies on my tablet. Back then, that was the height of technology. Hank was pretty laid back about this. He didn't burden me with tasks and never made me do extra work. He had just one rule. If someone showed up late at night acting strangely, I should call him without hesitation. It didn't matter if this woke him and his wife from a deep sleep. If something suspicious happened, Hank wanted to know immediately. I thought it was fair. The gas station was Hank's life project, his retirement plan. If anything went wrong, all his financial security would go with it. You understand what I mean. So even though it felt a bit demeaning, as if I couldn't handle taking care of the place myself, I agreed to call Hank whenever there was any sign of trouble. When he explained his golden rule to me, I admit it made me a bit uneasy. It felt like maybe the station was a passing point for weird people at night. But the reality was quite different. As I said, I spent months there and never saw anything that could be considered strange or out of the ordinary. Until one night it happened. I was in the back office, dividing my attention between the security monitors and a copy of The Walking Dead on my tablet, when I saw a solitary figure approaching the station. We had 3 cameras, one directed at the pumps, another at the store entrance, and a third showing the inside of the store as seen from the back office. I watched the man walking toward the store, passing the pumps, and entering the field of view of the second camera. But instead of entering the store like any other person, he stopped right at the door. He stood right in the center of the second camera's image, so I could observe every detail. He looked like a typical rural Oregon family man, work boots, worn jeans, and a baseball cap with some hunting or fishing logo. Literally the most common type of person who might pass through there. But his manner, the way he behaved, definitely caught my attention. To be fair, it's not exactly true that nothing strange ever happened there. There was one time before this night when I needed to call Hank in the middle of the night. A completely out-of-her-mind woman was screaming like a demon near the pumps. It was a Saturday, probably between 4 and 4:30 in the morning. I did what Hank asked and called him at home. I told him about the woman and how much those screams were making me uneasy. He just asked what she looked like. I gave a description, and then he said, "Oh, it's just drunk Rhonda after payday. She'll leave when she gets tired, and you know what." Eventually, she stopped screaming and walked away, as if she had finished her performance for that night. But back to the guy with the sports cap. He simply stopped in front of the camera and stood there without moving. It wasn't as scary as someone screaming like a banshee, but still quite strange. I thought he might just be tired or something. But as I watched, I saw his head begin to turn slowly, his neck rotating until he looked directly into the camera lens. I know it was just an impression, but it seemed like he was looking right at me. And I can say it was one of the most unsettling feelings I've ever experienced. When his behavior crossed the line from eccentric to really concerning, I didn't hesitate and called Hank. This time, I didn't even feel diminished asking for help. Whatever this guy's problem was, it wasn't something as simple as being under the influence of drugs. It was scary on a very different level. Hank answered the phone and, as usual, asked me to describe the strange subject. I started talking, but suddenly Hank hung up on me. I looked at the screen again, and the guy had disappeared from view. He was no longer at the store or near the pumps. I thought, where the hell did he go? And at the same time wondered why Hank had hung up so abruptly. He had always said to call if something weird happened, and the last time, he was a bit sleepy but calm. So I was pondering what could be so different about this night. And then suddenly, I see him on the monitors. Hank was running toward the station wearing only boxer shorts and a tank top, with a shotgun in his hands. He entered the store asking where the guy was. When I explained that the subject had vanished, that he seemed to have gone away, Hank rushed past me, going to the office to review the monitors. I was also in shock. What the hell was he doing with a shotgun? I asked what was happening several times, but he just told me to shut up and said I needed to stay alert while he rewound the recordings to find the man's face. I stood watching as he went back through the images until he finally found what he was looking for. And that's when I saw Hank turn white as a sheet. Whoever that man was, Hank was completely terrified of him, so frightened that he felt the need to come running, armed, to the station to protect me. And that vision of Hank being that scared made me feel the same fear. After Hank called the police, he sent me home that night. The next day, he called to say he would understand if I decided not to return to work. I asked just once if he could tell me who that man was, but Hank paused and just repeated that he would understand if I didn't want to come back. I thanked him for the job, wished him good luck, and hung up. As I mentioned before, I still feel a bit guilty for not visiting him more. Hank was an amazing guy and an exemplary boss, but without knowing who that man was, without understanding why Hank was so afraid of him, I simply couldn't imagine working there again. I wasn't willing to risk my life for a job at a gas station, no matter how much I liked my boss. And if there was a man out there capable of scaring someone as tough as Hank, What chance would I have? I go to Fitness Evolution every other day and have noticed an employee who always cleans the floor and the massage chair rooms when I'm there. I had never thought much about him until one day, while I was on the treadmill. He started cleaning the treadmills from the front, right at the bottom part. It's a bit difficult to describe, but he was positioned in a way that gave him a complete view of my legs and groin area. He started cleaning about 5 treadmills away from me and even sanitized a machine while a young man was still using it. When he approached my treadmill, I became uncomfortable with how close he was to my legs. He seemed to take longer than normal cleaning, then moved to the treadmill on my left, which was unoccupied, but focused only on the treadmill itself. He knelt down and meticulously cleaned, taking a long time with this task. He didn't do this type of cleaning with any other treadmill. I noticed that he didn't even touch the treadmills that the elderly lady and another man were using in front of me. That day, I was wearing my new running leggings and was excited for my workout session until this episode happened. Now I'm feeling conflicted and don't know if I'm overreacting or if he was just doing his job. I've started to notice other patterns too. He seems to always be working when I'm there, regardless of the time of day I go. I've switched my schedule around 3 times now, and somehow he's always on shift during my workouts. Last week, I mentioned it casually to another woman in the locker room, and she said she had also noticed him paying special attention to female members, especially when they're on certain machines. Apparently, I'm not the only one who's felt uncomfortable. I've considered speaking to management about it, but I'm concerned they might not take it seriously since he's technically just cleaning the equipment. Part of me wonders if I should just switch gyms, but I really like this location and it's convenient for me. Yesterday, I went to use the leg press machine, and he immediately appeared with cleaning supplies and started wiping down the equipment right next to it. He positioned himself where he could watch me the entire time. When I finished my set and got up, he quickly moved away. It's getting to the point where I feel like I'm being watched throughout my entire workout. I'm thinking about bringing a friend with me next time to see if he behaves differently when I'm not alone. Has anyone else had experiences like this at their gym? I want to make sure I'm not just being paranoid before I take any action. In my last year of high school, I had a weekend job at a gas station in a rural area of my home state, Montana. Every Saturday and Sunday, I worked the second shift, from 2 in the afternoon until around 9 at night. On a summer afternoon, I headed to work under a clear blue sky dotted with few clouds. Call me nostalgic, but I love driving through Montana. I feel like there's no other place quite like it. When you take a road leading out of a small town, it seems like the whole world opens up before you, stretching as far as the eye can see. The horizon remains almost intact, interrupted only occasionally by a windmill, a barn, or a cluster of trees. On a sunny day, it's like a painting. And up until that moment, the month of July had blessed us with only sunny days and light rains. However, that afternoon, as I drove down the road and looked toward the horizon, I saw some frightening storm clouds approaching. The rule is that most storm clouds look more intimidating than they really are, especially those huge, threatening cloud walls that seemed to come straight out of the scriptures. Most of the time, this results in a little rain, strong wind, and nothing more than that. But this time, something told me this storm would be different. When I arrived at the station, storm alerts were already being broadcast on local radio stations. My coworker and I usually made the shift change quickly, but with the storm warnings, the work multiplied. We needed to lock all the windows, then secure the external facilities or bring them inside, and check the pumps before shutting off the fuel. My coworker went to charge the generator in case of a power outage, while I gathered several flashlights and batteries. Since we work at a gas station, candles are not an option, so flashlights become a priority. We already had a prepared shelter, the station's office. So after checking that the first aid kit was complete, we kept the radio tuned, attentive to any weather alert or important announcement. We thought that with the storm, people would stay home, and the shift would be busy, but without much company. But we were wrong. Within an hour, 3 cars arrived, 2 with solo drivers, and 1 with a mother and her 2 young daughters. Their route home passed directly through the storm's path, so instead of risking it, they came to us asking for shelter. And of course, we couldn't refuse. We weren't prepared to accommodate so many people, especially overnight, but there was no alternative. We offered drinks and snacks so they could calm down while the storm intensified. And as if it were possible, it got even worse. Everything was relatively quiet until we heard the tornado sirens. I believe all the adults there were already accustomed to the sound, but it frightened the 2 girls, who began to cry, begging their mother to take them home. When objects started being hurled from our roof, and a piece of debris hit one of the cars, the alarm went off, making the girls cry even more. The poor things simply didn't understand what was happening. It only took a few more seconds of things falling from the roof for us to decide it was time to seek shelter in the station's office. The office had enough space to accommodate everyone, and fortunately, the sound of sirens and winds was muffled there, which helped the 2 little girls calm down a bit. But at a certain point, something tore across the parking lot and shattered the large glass window with a crash that sounded like an explosion. That startled both me and my coworker, and we were expecting something like that to happen. But the girls almost lost control. They probably thought the building was collapsing. One of the solo drivers also became panicked when the girls started screaming. She had a panic attack and tried to run back to her car. Realizing what she was about to do, my coworker went to her, warning that going outside meant imminent danger, but she wouldn't listen. She was thrashing, screaming, and it took me and the other driver to help restrain her. The little girls were screaming so loudly, they were nearly running out of breath watching the scene as she struggled for a few more seconds, and then suddenly started crying. At that moment, she stopped resisting and began apologizing between tears. The storm kept us together there for the next several hours. I remember how, in a way, what united us and prevented us from giving in to fear was the focus on keeping the girls from screaming until they fainted. I made an effort to keep them calm, assuring them everything would be okay, but thinking back, I believe we were all trying to calm ourselves too. Talking to those girls was a way of projecting tranquility for ourselves, perhaps. Over time, the winds began to lose strength. and after an hour, it seemed safe for everyone to start moving. We went to the store and found everything absolutely devastated. There was so much debris scattered that it was impossible to know exactly what had broken the window and caused that crash. There was glass, snacks, magazines, and pieces of rubble everywhere. We gathered food for them to take for the rest of the night before they headed to their cars. The young mother especially expressed her gratitude to us for helping keep her daughters calm, even when she herself was about to fall apart. After the goodbyes, everyone went their separate ways except me and my coworker, who stood looking at the scene and thinking about what we had just experienced. The storm had brought strangers together in a way that felt almost surreal. For those few hours, we weren't just individuals seeking shelter. We became a community, looking out for each other in the face of something much bigger than ourselves. I'll never forget the look in the mother's eyes when she thanked us, or how the little girls eventually fell asleep leaning against each other, exhausted from fear, but finally at peace. As I helped clean up the next day, I realized that sometimes it takes the worst of nature to bring out the best in humanity. And while I never saw any of those people again, I often wonder where they are and hope they tell this story too. About the night they rode out a tornado in a gas station with a bunch of strangers who became, for a few hours, something like family. In December of 2018, a 54-year-old man living in northern Washington sat down at his computer and opened a browser quite different from the conventional ones. Using software called Tor, he managed not only to access the surface web completely anonymously, but also entered the hidden and intricate structure known as the dark web. Protected by this digital anonymity, the man began the extensive process of uploading the necessary files to launch his own website. However, unlike others who seek to exploit the anonymity of the dark web for profit in illegal markets or cybercrimes, his goal was different. His site would be called Phoenix, and its purpose was to gather the largest collection of child exploitation materials ever recorded. Just a few months later, Phoenix caught the attention of the FBI as part of Operation Guardian, one of the largest global efforts to combat child exploitation in law enforcement history. According to the Bureau, they were aware of the site from the moment it was created, but were prevented from acting until they could precisely locate the site's server and ultimately identify its operator. The discovery came thanks to a tip from an international police organization that promotes cooperation between security forces in fighting crime. Agents in Europe received a warning from a citizen who, while casually browsing the internet, had made a terrifying discovery. When trying to directly enter the IP address of another computer, the informant probably typed something wrong because, upon pressing enter, he found a truly disturbing site. There, accessible to any ordinary surface web user, was a vast collection of child exploitation material housed under the name of a site called Phoenix. Finally, in January of 2019, FBI agents managed to trace the servers to a house in Bellingham, Washington. With a decisive operation carried out at dawn, the 54-year-old man was identified as Richard Wilson. Realizing he faced life imprisonment in a federal protective custody unit, Richard agreed to fully cooperate with the FBI agents, granting them complete and unrestricted access to his devices and hard drive. The FBI spent weeks extracting data from the hard drive that contained the site's backups. Richard Wilson's computer revealed a veritable mine of information about the identity and location of others involved in the exploitation network. However, instead of shutting down Phoenix as would be expected, the FBI opted to keep it operational. Between January 19th and February 23rd, 2019, the only operators of one of the busiest child exploitation forums on the dark web were, surprisingly, agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Undercover agents went to great lengths to imitate Wilson's writing style and schedule, ensuring users believed nothing had changed. During these 5 weeks, the site's user count increased by more than 30% as people from across the dark web headed to this growing and revolting collection of depravity. Throughout this time, FBI cybercrime specialists used a network investigation technique based on malware to infiltrate visitors' computers, exposing sensitive personal information that could be used to track them and make arrests. When they finally shut down the site, in collaboration with various international law enforcement agencies, the FBI managed to arrest almost 1,000 individuals worldwide. 5 of these arrests resulted in immediate convictions of some of the site's main users, representing a strong blow to the global trade in child exploitation content. When news that so many abusers had been captured in Operation Guardian reached the public, the reaction was celebratory. However, as more details emerged, and journalists revealed that the FBI had kept the site running after its creator's arrest, a wave of indignation spread. The Electronic Frontier Foundation, an organization that defends online freedoms, harshly criticized the FBI for practicing the same crime it was supposed to prevent. Additionally, others pointed out there were indications that the FBI not only operated the site, but also improved its speed, navigation, and accessibility. The FBI justified its actions by stating that all measures taken were in pursuit of its mission, and reminded critics that the operation led to the capture of nearly 1,000 dangerous criminals and the rescue of hundreds of abused children around the world. Despite this, in one specific case, this bold strategy ended up allowing one of the predators they sought to arrest to escape without facing any charges. The initial search warrant obtained by FBI agents limited the collection of information to the Eastern District of Virginia. However, the data mining application developed based on malware had the sole purpose of indiscriminately extracting data from anyone who accessed the site, without location restrictions. This resulted in problems when it became clear that data had been collected outside the warrant's limits. In at least one case, a suspect was released without charges because the warrant was considered invalid for that specific situation. To some, this might seem like a simple mistake, like a shortcut or communication failure. However, ignoring the restrictions of a federal warrant is a severe violation of judicial procedures, a basic rule that even a small-town sheriff knows should not be disregarded. Given this, the question arises: why would an experienced FBI agent make a decision that would risk jeopardizing such a crucial investigation? Federal Public Defender Assistant Peter Arnold claimed to have evidence that Phoenix distributed about 200 videos, 9,000 images, and 13,000 links to illegal images of children, while the site was under FBI supervision. Arnold based his claims on messages from Phoenix users, who frequently commented on the site's good functioning during the FBI's control period. In 2023, the United States Court of Appeals for the First Circuit assessed whether the FBI should have operated the Phoenix site in the case of United States v. Thompson. In the decision, the court argued that operating the site, even for just 5 weeks, constituted outrageous government conduct that violated due process. The court also highlighted that by keeping Phoenix active, the FBI distributed this material to hundreds of thousands of people, with no control over what they would do with those images. From then on, although the court stated that the government's conduct reached the limit of outrageous, it decided not to dismiss the charges. Ideally, according to them, the FBI should not have managed a child exploitation site, not even for a brief period. But in the court's words, we don't live in an ideal world. With the understanding that a new site could emerge in less than 24 hours, the FBI chose to continue administering Phoenix, believing that the benefits far outweighed the many risks involved. Indeed, the FBI's management of Phoenix resulted in arrests, convictions, and the rescue of hundreds of exploited children around the world. However, a question still lingers in the air. At what point do the ends cease to justify the means? Is it ever acceptable for law enforcement to engage in the very crimes they seek to prevent, even if their ultimate goal is to capture more criminals? The Phoenix case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about ethics, law enforcement, and the lengths we're willing to go to protect the most vulnerable among us. I grew up on the West Coast, but ended up attending college in Maine, as far from home as I could possibly get. By my junior year, I was desperate for any excuse to visit my family, and fate handed me the perfect opportunity when I discovered my aunt and uncle were organizing a massive family reunion at their mountain cabin. My family has always been enormous and incredibly close-knit. My grandparents had 12 children, and I maintained tight relationships with all my aunts, uncles, and cousins, with one notable exception. Of my grandparents' 12 children, everyone had married except Uncle Marcus, who spent most of his life cycling in and out of prison. Nobody had seen Uncle Marcus for quite some time. My grandmother tried to maintain contact, but his reckless lifestyle choices created distance between them. Not because she wanted it that way, but because Marcus was, frankly, a troublemaker. It was a sensitive subject, so at family gatherings, we avoided mentioning him. I caught a flight home for the reunion and was thrilled to see everyone had made it. My aunt and uncle who owned the cabin were considerably older than my other relatives. Besides their children, I was the oldest cousin. With so many kids around and my natural inclination toward playfulness, I suggested we organize a massive game of hide-and-seek. The cousins and children loved the idea, and we quickly divided into teams. My aunt and uncle's cabin was enormous, with countless hiding places. My aunt said any spot on the property was fair game, only asking that we avoid the main road, though it wasn't heavily trafficked due to the remote location. Any vehicle that passed typically roared by at around 80 miles per hour. When it was my turn to hide, I headed straight for the tool shed. I was looking for an interesting spot when I remembered a small loft accessible only by ladder. It wasn't very high, and the ladder was sturdy and secure, so I wasn't concerned about anyone getting hurt. As I approached the ladder, something on the ground caught my attention, a pile of cigarette butts near the base. I knew my aunt and uncle didn't smoke, especially now that my uncle had developed serious lung problems. I found it strange, but figured perhaps some worker had been there smoking, or maybe even one of my cousins. I didn't think much about it, having worked with people who tossed cigarette butts on the ground, so it wasn't exactly a red flag. I climbed the ladder, and upon reaching the loft, things got even weirder. Among the storage boxes was scattered trash, empty cans, potato chip bags, that sort of thing. I found it odd because, considering my aunt and uncle's condition, it was hard to imagine they could climb up there to clean. I decided to take a closer look. On the dusty floor, I noticed footprints. I went quiet for a moment and tried to listen. I thought I heard breathing, but maybe it was just my imagination stemming from the tension of the moment. I approached the back of the loft until I froze. There, sitting and staring directly at me, was a man with a dirty, worn-down appearance. My immediate reaction was to think a homeless person had found shelter in the shed and was camping out there. But before I could react, the man stood up and rushed toward me, knocking me down as he passed. I heard him jump to the floor and run out of the shed. But even before he reached me, I realized this wasn't just some unknown homeless person. It was my uncle. Uncle Marcus. At first, I almost didn't recognize him, but those eyes were unmistakable. As he ran past me, I could clearly see his face. Instead of making a scene, I calmly descended and told my aunt and uncle what had happened. They were outraged, but also quite frightened. They were the ones who had thrown Uncle Marcus out years ago, and he had threatened them multiple times since. Knowing he had been camping in the loft made my aunt turn pale, as if she'd seen a ghost. Soon the news spread throughout the reunion, and the hide-and-seek game was interrupted. Nevertheless, I continued playing ball with the children, trying to distract them. The police arrived shortly after, and we explained everything to them. We had no idea where Uncle Marcus might be, but that didn't make much difference. They found him about an hour later, walking alongside the road. As soon as the officer approached, he tried to flee but didn't get very far. The officer detained him, and upon searching him, found one of my aunt and uncle's kitchen knives. I know this story might not sound terrifying to some, but imagine being in my position or in my aunt and uncle's shoes. Imagine climbing to the loft and encountering a strange man. Then go further and consider what it would be like to be my aunt and uncle. This man, their own brother, had been living in their shed, and at some point had entered their house to take that knife. And why else would he need that knife, if not to use it against my aunt and uncle? He denies it, of course, but that look in his eyes gave me the certainty that he had something sinister in mind. Most of the time, we were those quiet kids in middle school, not the type to attend wild parties or get into trouble. The majority of our weekends consisted of hanging out in someone's basement playing board games or just lounging in the backyard. But on one particular night, I decided to invite more people to my house than usual. The evening was absolutely perfect, and we all ended up outside, chatting and enjoying each other's company. As the sky darkened, a friend suggested we play manhunt, basically hide and seek for teenagers, played in teams. I made sure to pair up with Samantha. At the time, I was completely infatuated with her, and thought this game would be the perfect opportunity to spend some time just the two of us. My neighborhood was small, and everyone knew each other well. Playing manhunt around the area wasn't anything unusual, and neighbors already knew that if they saw kids running through yards, there was nothing to worry about. It might sound strange to some, but in a small town like mine, this was perfectly normal. People were more trusting back then, I guess. To my luck, Samantha also had an interest in me, so we managed to end up as partners. The others organized themselves into pairs as well, and after that, we drew lots to determine who would start as the seekers. It wasn't our team, and I was super excited and a bit nervous about spending that dark night with Samantha. The two seekers went to the garage and started counting to 100, while all the hiders scattered throughout the street, looking for the best hiding spots. To add an extra twist to the game, we decided to include a challenge instead of just hiding. Each team needed to retrieve a small flag hidden inside the garage. If someone managed to grab the flag and hide again without being caught, the seeking team would lose. It was a fun mix of hide and seek and capture the flag. There were also some minor rules, but nothing too significant. I noticed some of my friends sneaking into the backyards of certain houses, which were the most obvious hiding spots. Since I knew they would look there first, I suggested to Samantha that we stay in front of the houses, the last place they would check. She was all smiles, laughing and agreeing with every idea I had. At the end of the street was a smaller house where an elderly gentleman lived who had unfortunately lost his wife about 7 years earlier. He was a really nice guy, and since she passed, he spent most of his time either fishing or near the water. For some reason, that night, his boat was parked on the trailer in his driveway. I pointed to the boat and told Samantha it would be an incredible hiding spot. She agreed, and we snuck underneath that massive fishing boat. Under there, we were very close to each other, exchanging laughs and whispering conversations. At one point, she said she was cold and snuggled up against me. I thought to myself that the night had already reached perfection. A few minutes later, we heard footsteps running that stopped very close to the edge of the boat. We covered our mouths, trying to hold back laughter. Suddenly, someone outside whispered urgently, "Hurry up." Another pair of footsteps appeared beside the boat. The voice was strange, and I didn't recognize it, but I figured it was my friend intentionally changing his voice. Soon, the footsteps disappeared into the night. When Samantha and I were about to leave our hiding spot to try to grab the flag, we heard a desperate scream. "Help! Somebody help me!" We emerged from under the boat, frightened. The sound was so disturbing that it seemed to carry intense pain and sadness. It was the elderly gentleman who owned the boat where we were hiding. Fortunately, he recognized me. He was visibly shaken, stammering and awkward. Within minutes, all our friends left their hiding spots and joined us at the entrance to the man's house. In a weak voice, he explained, "I was reading a book when 2 large men wearing masks broke in. They stole my safe and went out the front door. I tried to stop them, but they were too strong. My heart ached for him. We rushed to my parents' house, and my mother called the police. They questioned especially Samantha and me, since we had seen two men passing by, but we couldn't identify much. I never knew if they managed to arrest the thieves. The police suspected it might have been someone who knew the gentleman, since his normally alert Doberman didn't make a single bark during the invasion. Life moved on, and the following weekend we were hanging out again. But I can assure you we never played manhunt again. Perhaps it remained in our subconscious, or maybe it was just a sign that we were growing up. What brought me to tell this story now was a recent memory. Last weekend, my parents mentioned the time when we used to play manhunt, and this memory came back to me forcefully. I asked them if there was any detail from that night that I didn't know. I discovered that, according to the gentleman, there was one point he only shared with my parents. Those two men were heavily armed. Thinking about it now is even more frightening. Samantha and I were just a few feet away from two dangerous men in the middle of an armed robbery. It was one of those moments that opens your eyes, even in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The darkest figures can still hide in the shadows. Recently, I had been venturing into the world of online dating. I never struggled with meeting people, which I consider a good thing. But the idea of connecting with someone through the internet always intrigued me. During that period, I only met women at work or in bars, and I wanted to expand my horizons to see if I could find someone different. I don't remember if it was on Bumble or another one of those apps, but I met a woman named Valerie. The name caught my attention right away, and she was stunning. With so many stories of fake profiles and people pretending to be others, I thought Valerie might also be a scam. I was cautious and chatted gradually until it became clear she was a real person. Without hesitation, I set up a date. I decided that dinner and drinks would be the plan. It's what I know best, but she had other plans. Since I was trying to explore outside my comfort zone, I agreed to pretty much any idea. She suggested a place that surprised me. She asked if I knew about a forest preserve near my hometown. This forest was immense, with a trail that stretched across several counties, or at least that's what they said. We ended up agreeing to meet at this park for our first date. I prepared myself, got a haircut, and organized a picnic for us in the forest. Since autumn had already passed, we scheduled for midweek, expecting a less crowded location. On the day, I went to pick her up in the downtown area, outside the building where she said she lived. We made the 30-minute drive to the forest, and as we imagined, there was only one car in the parking lot. I was excited about having the place practically to ourselves. Not that the presence of other people would have made a difference, since the forest was genuinely enormous. Next to the parking lot was an incredible panoramic view. I took her hand as we walked toward the landscape, and at that moment, I revealed my surprise, the picnic. She was super excited and seemed genuinely happy. Nothing too elaborate, just some sandwiches and chips. We sat on the blanket I had brought and took the opportunity to chat for a bit. It was a relief to have a date outside of a bar or some noisy place. After putting everything away, I asked if she wanted to explore some trails. She gave me a smile, looked around, and said, "Actually, I have a better idea, but promise you won't judge me." I was curious and went along with the mood. With a somewhat shy look and a hesitant voice, she said, "Let's play hide and seek." The suggestion was unexpected and a bit odd. It wasn't what I expected when she said she had an idea. She gave me a little pat on the arm while laughing and said, "Come on, it'll be fun. Just the two of us here in the forest, hiding from each other." Writing about it now, I can see how strange it might sound, but at that moment, with her playful demeanor, it seemed like a good idea. Honestly, I don't think I was thinking clearly, if you know what I mean. I agreed, and she became even more excited. She said I should hide first, while she counted to 30. I avoided going too deep into the forest, because I really had no idea where I was getting myself into. I ran a bit further in, until I found a dense group of trees that seemed like a good hiding spot. I stood there behind the trees and started timing on my phone. That's when, leaning against the tree, I felt something cold touch the back of my neck. I didn't even have time to react before hearing a low, firm voice say, "Empty your pockets slowly. Put your wallet, keys, and phone on the ground right in front of you. Don't look back, and don't think about being a hero unless you want to feel the weight of this cold steel on your neck." I did as he commanded. I felt his hand extending in front of me to grab my things, but I kept my eyes closed. Whatever he was using to threaten me pressed even harder against my neck, and he said, "Now count to 1,000 before moving again. If you don't, your night is going to get much worse." I heard his footsteps moving away. Without thinking twice, I started counting to 1,000, overwhelmed by fear. When I finally finished counting, I turned around and ran out of the forest. I looked for Valerie everywhere but couldn't find her, and I began to fear the worst. Even though he had taken my keys, the thief didn't steal my car, a small victory. Although without the keys, I couldn't use it. I remembered that not far from the parking lot was a gas station. I decided to run there and ask them to call the police. I gave all the information to the officers, explaining that I feared something might have happened to Valerie. After the investigation, it was as if she had simply vanished from the map. Her dating profile had been deleted, and no one reported having seen her. The police suggested she might have been involved with the person who robbed me, since no one besides me reported her disappearance. You never think something like this will happen to you. I just hope she's okay, but knowing she might have been involved, I also hope she doesn't hurt anyone else. Writing this story is a challenge for me. When I was a child, everything seemed normal. Nothing appeared out of the ordinary. It's as if during this phase, you believe your family is invincible, incapable of any harm. But my sister and I soon learned that life isn't always made up of just smiles and sunny days. This happened at least 25 years ago, maybe more. At that time, we spent the night at our grandparents' house. It might sound boring to some people, but we absolutely loved it. Grandma always prepared delicious snacks and let us watch any movie we wanted, while Grandpa played games with us, inventing new and creative ways to make them even more fun. He had an incredible imagination, and being with them was always an enjoyable experience. By that time, Grandpa's health was already deteriorating, but we didn't notice. Looking back now, It's clear that he no longer had the same energy as before. But in childhood, you simply don't notice these signs. I suggested we play hide and seek, one of my favorites. He always found the best hiding spots and somehow invented new places each round. My sister was excited, and we both insisted that Grandpa play with us. He hesitated a bit at first, but soon opened a smile and agreed. We played several rounds, and it was pure fun. When it was Grandpa's turn to hide, we were filled with anticipation. We knew it would be a challenge, and finding him always gave us a sense of victory. My sister and I even created a competition between us to see who would find him first. I decided to go upstairs, while my sister stayed downstairs. I entered the guest room where we were going to sleep, and noticed that the closet door was slightly open. I was sure it had been closed before. Carefully, I went over there, and through the crack, I saw my grandfather standing inside the closet, staring fixedly at the wall. I opened the door and announced that I had found him. He didn't move. He remained motionless, almost like a statue, staring at the wall. I approached a bit more and held the back of his checkered shirt. When I said his name, he suddenly turned and with a voice full of anger and something cruel shouted, "Get away from me." It was almost as if he were another person. This left me terrified. I was so frightened that I ran to the kitchen and burst into tears in Grandma's arms. I'm sure she knew what was happening, but she still comforted me. Not even 2 minutes later, Grandpa came down the stairs with that lively smile and said, "I think you couldn't find me. Looks like I won this round." Grandma went to him and in a whisper asked him to rest a bit and go sit in the armchair. He seemed a bit confused, but agreed. And I remember feeling a mix of pity and fear, especially when remembering the look on his face up in the closet. I spent the rest of the evening terrified. Grandma commented to him that I wasn't feeling well and would stay in our room for the rest of the night. My sister didn't know anything about it. I told her that Grandpa had shouted at me, but she didn't believe it. She said Grandpa would never do something so frightening. In the middle of the night, my sister woke me up scared. As soon as I noticed her nervousness, I asked what was happening. She told me she heard voices coming from the closet, the same one where Grandpa had hidden. I became alert because the closet was near the bed, and she was right. We could hear voices inside. One seemed cheerful with soft little laughs, the other sad, almost like a silent cry. We didn't know what to do. I approached the closet door while my sister held onto my shirt, and I peeked inside. I remember clearly what I saw. There weren't multiple people. It was my grandfather making all those voices. He laughed, cried, and spoke in a completely uncontrolled manner. We ran out of the room and went down to the living room on the first floor. We grabbed some blankets and hid underneath them. Grandma found us there early in the morning. We said we had woken up early and were waiting for her to get up, trying to hide our fear. We didn't want to tell the truth about Grandpa. We were terrified and confused by what had happened in the closet. The voices he made were the most frightening I had ever heard. While Grandma prepared breakfast, Grandpa was sitting in his armchair watching sports highlights, appearing completely normal. No sign of what had happened the night before. After eating, we stayed in the living room waiting for our mom to arrive and pick us up. When she finally did, we rushed to the car. Outside, we saw Grandma talking quietly with her on the porch. We watched our mom's expression change to a deep sadness. Upon entering the car, she asked us how the night had been. We told her everything: Grandpa's shout in the closet, the strange laughter and crying we heard during the night. I don't remember exactly what she said, but it was something like, "Grandpa isn't well, and we need to take a break from visits for now." That devastated us. Years later, we discovered that Grandpa had started developing dementia. Over time, he truly lost everything mentally, to the point where he no longer knew what was happening around him. It was something deeply sad. Today, I can understand this better. But at the time, as a child, seeing that disturbing look in his eyes and hearing his unhinged voices was something that haunted me in nightmares for a very long time. Nothing compared to those classic birthday sleepovers from childhood. Everyone together, playing games, staying up late. You know how it was. The day was beautiful, and we were 6 children in total. As soon as we arrived, we headed straight for a basketball game. Since the plan was to spend the night playing PlayStation 3, we decided to enjoy the outdoors while the weather was good, with no threat of rain. We organized a one-on-one tournament and played for quite a while. I don't know if kids still do this, but in the neighborhood where we grew up, we would pull the basketball hoop to the front of the house. When a car passed, we would pause and move off the street, but this didn't happen very frequently. During the game, we noticed a black sedan, all dented and scratched, that kept driving by multiple times. Generally, we wouldn't notice such details, but the condition of the car and the number of times it circled around caught our attention. It wasn't every minute, but every few minutes it would return, making it clear that it wasn't just going around the block. The 4th or 5th time it passed, we started to feel a bit uncomfortable. The last time, it stopped at the end of the street. We stared for a few moments, but soon returned to our game. That's when it started reversing, and then everyone became apprehensive. It came all the way back, until it stopped right under our basketball hoop and lowered the window. The man had a strange appearance. I only remember the very bad skin, a weird haircut, and an extremely high-pitched voice. When he spoke, he said, "Hey guys, you're good at basketball." I was heading to the park to shoot some hoops, but I ended up without a ball. How about lending me yours? Some of you can even come along if you want. What do you say? I knew this was trouble and wanted distance. I told my friend that we needed to go inside immediately, and suggested that his mother wouldn't like seeing us talking to a stranger. Most of us were quick to refuse, remembering the many times we had heard such stories in school lessons. Some friends, however, were so naive they didn't even realize the danger there. I had to pull one of them, who was already about to open the passenger door to get in with the guy, taking one of our balls with him. We started heading inside, even with the stranger still talking to us. The last thing I heard, which gave me chills, was him saying, "Come on, guys. I won't tell your parents anything. You won't get in trouble." Even being young, I understood what that meant, and I was scared. We closed the door, and I peeked through the window. I saw the neighbor from across the street come out of his house and approach the car. But the stranger left before he reached it. Most of my friends were oblivious to that weird situation, but I still had a bad feeling. Closer to nightfall, my friends suggested we play hide and seek outside. I was still worried about the possibility of that guy being around, but we ended up playing anyway. After a while, the game made me forget about him a bit. While hiding, I was looking for a place where no one could find me. I thought I had found the perfect hiding spot, but I was about to discover I was very wrong. Behind my friend's fence, there was a narrow passage between the back of his fence and the neighbor's fence. All the houses on that street had fences, so this passage extended almost the entire block. I was hiding in that narrow passage, confident that none of my friends would think to look behind the fences. Leaning against one of the wooden posts, suddenly there were footsteps in the tall grass. Since no one took care of that area, the grass was quite overgrown. I looked down the path and saw a figure approaching, but the darkness made identification difficult. When it got closer, I could clearly see who it was, the guy from the black sedan. He was approaching with a wide smile, and in a slightly elevated whisper said, "Hey friend, what about that basketball? You guys don't seem to be using it now." I replied that I didn't have one and began to slowly back away. I could hear his breathing and notice that he was accelerating his pace in my direction. If you're wondering why I didn't scream for help, the answer is that I was naive, I think. I was scared. I knew the situation was bad, but for some reason, I felt that if I screamed, it would only make things worse. I can't explain it, but that's what my mind thought at that moment. I started moving faster through the passage, and he also accelerated. I don't know how close he really was, but I could hear his breathing, and it seemed like he was right behind me. That's when a loud voice shouted, "Hey, you there. What are you doing? Do you know this kid?" I kept running. I heard the guy say something in a low tone, and right after that, he jumped over one of the fences. I ran with all my might and shouted for my friends to meet in front of the house. The neighbor came out of the passage and knocked on my friend's door. He talked with my friend's mother for a while, and she decided that the rest of the night would be spent indoors. I was relieved, but some of my friends weren't too thrilled about it. Nothing else happened that night, and I never saw that man or the car again. Only when I got older did I realize how frightening and dangerous that could have been. At the time, it was intense, but it didn't traumatize me. I think as a child, I didn't comprehend the severity of the situation. Parents, take good care of your children. There are indeed monsters hiding in all kinds of places, even in the most ordinary neighborhoods. The story I'm about to tell happened about 20 years ago, during my teenage years. Back then, I had a very close group of friends. Some were schoolmates, others were neighborhood kids. Almost every night, we would gather outside to play. We'd play dodgeball, tag, and a multitude of other games. Most of us lived very close by, with the farthest house being about 3 or 4 blocks away, which made it quite easy for us to meet up. After all, none of us were old enough to drive yet. Over time, our parents began allowing us to stay out later, and we started adding more excitement to our games. We expanded the territory for hiding when playing hide and seek, and made everything more thrilling. One night, my friend David suggested that we play flashlight tag in the cemetery nearby. He lived very close to a local cemetery, just about 5 or 6 houses from the main road. which was lined from end to end by this enormous cemetery. Everyone was excited about the idea, except me. My feeling was the opposite. I was terrified and didn't even want to think about going in there. But of course, I couldn't show that. Admitting fear was out of the question, so I ended up agreeing. We arranged to meet at the cemetery around 8:30 in the evening, when the side gate would still be accessible. That way we could enter, look around, and choose a good spot for the game before it got completely dark. We also decided that everyone would wear dark clothes and could bring 2 flashlights in case one stopped working. Each person would choose whether to keep their flashlight on or off. With it on, the chance of being found increased, but it also helped reduce fear. I remember telling my mom that I was going to David's house, and she asked, "It's already 8 o'clock. What time will you be back?" I said I wasn't sure yet, and she asked that if it was after 10, I should call her so my dad could come pick me up. She didn't want me walking back so late. We met in front of David's house, and from what I remember, there were 9 of us in total. We arrived at the cemetery earlier than planned, and began exploring the area in search of a good space for hide and seek. The cemetery was extensive, so we decided to establish clear boundaries for the hiding areas. We found a reasonable space near the exit, defined the rules, and started the game. Even though it wasn't completely dark, most of my anxiety had disappeared. Perhaps because we were playing before nightfall, I thought maybe we would play a few rounds and then leave. But before I realized it, we had only played once, and it was already dark. I expected that when we regrouped, everyone would decide to leave, but that's not what happened. My friends grabbed their flashlights, and soon we asked if anyone wanted to volunteer to be the seeker this time. Before anyone offered, my friend Michael stepped forward and said, "I will." We reviewed the rules. Whoever was caught in the beam of the flashlight was out and had to return to the large tree where we were talking before. Michael would count to 50, which left us with little time to get very far from the agreed area. As soon as he started counting, we all ran, turning off our flashlights and looking for good hiding spots. I didn't go very far. I found a large headstone next to a smaller tree and hid behind it. My idea was that by staying closer, I would be caught soon and could return to the tree, where I hoped other friends would also be gathering shortly. I could see Michael. He had his flashlight on and was walking in the opposite direction. I stayed quiet, sitting down. I could hear the wind blowing against the tree to my right, and suddenly a noise startled me. A scream came from elsewhere. Michael had found someone, and they were returning to the tree with the flashlight on. I decided to take advantage of this opportunity to move slowly and get a little closer to the main tree. I began moving silently with my flashlight off and spotted another person in dark clothing crouched behind a headstone. From what I could calculate, they were about 15 meters from me, although with the darkness, it might have been closer. I headed toward them, thinking we could hide together. But as I approached, a terrible smell enveloped me. It was an acidic smell, difficult to identify. I turned on my flashlight and saw that it wasn't one of my friends. Behind the headstone was an elderly man dressed in black, with a hood over his head. He looked directly at the light from my flashlight and said, "Would you be a good boy and help me?" I felt my body freeze. Though I probably only stopped for a few seconds, I tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. When I finally realized I needed to move, the man screamed in a shrill way, "Help me!" Without thinking twice, I started running, shaking my flashlight and screaming. I think I was trying to say, "Game over." But honestly, I was probably just uttering meaningless words. I saw several flashlights turning on and coming quickly in my direction. The man, who was still screaming, began to follow me. When the others realized what was happening and saw it wasn't a joke, there was a desperate race to the exit. What should have been a sequence of clear events became blurred in my mind. But one thing still resonates with clarity: the screams of "help me." We were all in shock or gripped by fear, and upon leaving the cemetery, we continued running toward David's house. We stopped at the end of his street, about 5 houses away, but even from there, we could still see the cemetery. Fortunately, the man didn't follow us. He suddenly stopped at the cemetery exit and just stood there by the gate. After a while, he began to walk slowly back inside until he completely disappeared into the darkness. We returned to David's house and gathered in the yard, still trying to understand what had just happened. To be honest, I don't remember much conversation at that time. I think after a few minutes, everyone started going home, and I soon called my dad to come pick me up. I spent several nights unable to sleep properly, afraid that man would appear at my house or at one of my friends' houses. After that, we all avoided returning to that cemetery. Today, as an adult, I find myself wondering, was it just someone trying to scare us? Someone with darker intentions? Or someone who genuinely needed our help? The story I'm about to tell happened about 12 years ago, during my high school years. I won't deny that I wasn't the best student or the most exemplary person back then. I've come a long way since, but there's one story from that time that I still vividly remember, and not for good reasons. The parents of a friend were out of town, and he invited us to spend some time at his house. He lived in a spacious house in a nice neighborhood, so we always took any chance to go there. A large group was present, and like typical teenagers, we were doing things that honestly we shouldn't have been doing. One detail I always found interesting was that the backyard of the house led directly to an apple orchard. For some context, when we were younger, we would go to the last row of apple trees and grab a few apples, feeling like super adventurers. One day, the orchard owner caught us in the act and yelled as if we were trying to destroy everything. At the time, we thought he was overreacting, but to him, it seemed very serious. This happened years ago, but whenever I returned to that house, I would remind my friend of how much I disliked that man. I don't know exactly what sparked this thought, but as I looked at the apple trees through the living room window, I suggested we play hide-and-seek in the orchard. The idea didn't convince everyone immediately, but after a while, they all ended up agreeing. I only intended to have fun with the game, but as soon as I stepped into the orchard, I felt that old dislike for the owner again. My friends and I were running between the rows of apple trees when I noticed the large barn at the back. I tried to push away my thoughts, but the idea of breaking into the barn and acting like a rebel was taking over. I told my friend I wanted to hide there and convinced him that no one would think to look inside the barn. The door was unlocked, which made my friend want to back out, but I was determined. I forced the latch and went in. When he finally entered with me, I reminded him of how much I hated the owner, but after a bit more persuasion, he gave in. He was always the straight-laced guy, and I wanted him to experience a bit of rebellion before graduation. Except that barn wasn't exactly an abandoned warehouse. It was the orchard shop where visitors bought apples, juices, and other artisanal products. I don't know what came over me, but I started messing up the place. I didn't cause any irreparable damage, but I knocked everything off the shelves and threw apples all over the floor. I even grabbed some bottles of homemade sauce. I was terrified, I admit. I knew I was breaking the law, and the fear of what might happen if I got caught wouldn't leave my mind. We were trespassing on someone else's property, and on top of that, causing damage to the place. Images of a possible arrest started haunting me, and it was at that moment that we heard the sound of a kick at the door. We looked, and there was the orchard owner, standing there holding a shotgun. We hid behind a shelf, hoping he wouldn't notice us. We could hear his slow footsteps, and the familiar voice from years ago ordering us to come out. We could hear him approaching more and more, his footsteps echoing like earthquakes, and we knew it was only a matter of time until he found us on the other side of the shelf. Then he fired a warning shot into the ceiling, almost making us scream. We immediately got up and ran out through the back door that we had unlatched earlier. He yelled for us to stop, but we didn't look back. We just kept running as if our lives depended on it. We zigzagged between the apple trees, hoping to lose the old man in that maze of trees. As we ran, we shouted to warn the others that we were being chased. Fortunately, they heard and ran back to the house without being noticed. We entered, turned off the lights, and watched through the window. Outside, we saw the man fire another shot into the sky. The loud sound made us jump, and the flash illuminated everything around. It was clear that he wasn't joking. He seemed determined to make us pay for the break-in. At first, the fear of being caught and arrested was already significant, but when he started shooting, the panic increased 100-fold. Suddenly, the idea of being arrested didn't seem so frightening anymore. Shortly after, everyone left the house except for me and a few others. We spent the rest of the night on high alert, watching through the window as he roamed among the trees. He never let go of the gun. He didn't fire any more shots, but he didn't need to. Those 2 discharges had already sent the message. I stayed awake until dawn, and believe it or not, he spent the entire night out there watching. The next morning, as I left my friend's house and passed by the orchard, I saw 2 police cars parked, and the owner was talking to the officers. I felt bad, remorseful, but I never went back. I never apologized or took responsibility for what I did. I overcame that rebellious phase of my life, but I'll never forget the fear of being chased by a man who, deep down, was just protecting what was his. More than 7 years ago, I started working at a warehouse in the small town where I was born. I decided to leave when my physical health began to deteriorate, and after some experiences, I was diagnosed with panic disorder and severe anxiety. The situation I'm about to relate completely changed how I viewed friendships after that job. I entered this job on April 1st, 2017, which I found quite curious, and I started without many expectations. All I wanted was to do my job, receive my salary, and go back home, where I had 2 children and a world of things to take care of. The work wasn't complicated, and the pay was good considering my responsibilities, so I really had nothing to complain about. I spent about 5 months working the second shift until I moved to the day shift. While I was on the second shift, I kept to myself. But one day I met someone from one of the production lines during a conversation about games. To maintain anonymity, I'll call him Ryan. Ryan was a nice guy, and we had quite a bit in common. That night when I got home, he appeared as a friend's suggestion on Facebook, another coincidence. I decided to add him, and from then on, we started talking more at work until he suggested that we hang out together. Soon, we were going out quite frequently. After about a month of friendship, he told me he wanted to introduce me to his partner. At first glance, she seemed like a decent person, friendly, not appearing to judge anyone, which made me feel very comfortable with her. Since then, I started spending time with them, whenever my kids were with my mother. Once we were at a restaurant, and he started to vent. Man, she's complicated sometimes. Like the other day, I forgot to take out the trash, and she threatened me. Said she would stab me if I didn't do it. I had never been in a relationship with someone who actually threatened their partner, but he added, "Oh, but she has good intentions, you know." When he told me that, I was concerned, but after all, we had only been friends for a month, so I thought maybe he was being a bit morbid, probably making a joke. I let out a nervous little laugh, but he looked at me seriously and said, "I'm not joking." She really did that. That left me particularly uneasy. Fast forward about 8 months, they were still together, and we continued to hang out regularly, kind of setting aside that story. In one of these meetups, he seemed a bit strange. I asked what was going on, and he smiled, saying, "Nothing, man. I'm just a little tired." But I noticed he wasn't looking at me when he said this. His eyes were fixed on her. The next day at work, I asked again what was happening. He looked at me and said, "Do you promise this stays just between us?" I agreed, of course. He then told me that he was determined to break up with her, but she had reacted intensely, grabbed a gun and pointed it at him, saying, "If I can't have you, then nobody will." He told me he tried to stay calm and find a way to escape that situation. I didn't know exactly what to say, so I just said, "You'll work this out, man. If you need a place to stay, you can count on me until you can get her out of the house." About a year later, he finally decided to end it. This time he opted to do it via text message, and again, she lost control. She threatened to find him and kill him, and he was actually at work that day, even though it was his day off. I received a message from him. "Hey, if she shows up at work asking about me, let me know, okay?" I found that strange because I had no idea what was unfolding, but surprisingly, she did appear at our workplace and asked where he was. I said, "I don't know anything. I thought you two had left town together or something." She just closed the car window and left. I called him and warned him that she had shown up. He called the police, and they ended up finding her on the road with a loaded gun in the car. 2 months later, he decided to talk to her again, and soon after, he came to tell me something that chilled me to the bone. He asked if I had seen her around. I replied that I hadn't, and he said, "If I were you, I'd take a few days off." Confused, I asked why, and he explained. She got out of jail, and her cousins are in town looking for people she has scores to settle with. You're one of them." At that moment, I felt profound terror. I took my children and left town, taking 2 weeks off from work. The next day, I found out that she and her cousins had gone to the neighboring town and shot 3 people in an apartment, taking their lives. I received the news the day after it happened. He knew they were coming after me because they had created a group on Facebook Messenger and included his name in it. They sent a list of people they intended to target. Many people saw it as spam and chose to ignore it, but he understood what it meant. Of the names on the list, 3 were of the people they killed. The 4th name was mine. When the evidence was found, and he finally decided to make public the messages and screenshots he had, they were all charged with first-degree murder. Since then, I've been much more cautious about who I would be willing to risk myself for, because even knowing the real intentions behind that list, he chose not to alert anyone else about what was happening. When I was 16 years old, my girlfriend and I were on the bus. Yes, we were a couple of girls, but at that time, we weren't doing anything beyond simply enjoying being together. We were just sitting, listening to music, doing homework. I had my arm resting on the back of her seat, and in a moment of affection, I leaned over and gave her a kiss on the head. Approximately half a minute later, I noticed she tensed up and looked at me with an uncomfortable expression. I asked what happened, and she murmured quietly, "Someone is touching me." I turned around quickly and saw an older, repulsive man caressing the back of her neck. I stood up immediately, looked directly at him, and asked in a loud voice, "What do you think you're doing?" He, with a shameless smile, replied, "Are you 2 sisters?" I said right away, "No, you disgusting pervert." And he, as if it were nothing, still replied, "Oh, that's a shame. I wanted to see you 2 kiss." The bus was full, and leaving meant losing our seats, so I asked him to leave us alone and sat back down. Less than a minute later, I felt his hand pass under my arm, and he started twirling her hair. I stood up to confront him, and he just laughed, saying, "Come on, just a little kiss." Kiss her for daddy, how disgusting. I decided that it had gone too far. I walked down the aisle to the front of the bus and called out to the driver, whom we knew well since we took that route every day. Luckily for us, it was Uncle Rick, a burly veteran who looked after the students as if they were his own family. He accelerated the bus, pulled off the highway, and stopped at the next stop with a loud screech. Then he opened the back door, stood up, and announced that he needed a clear path to the back of the bus. He marched firmly to the back of the bus, stopped in front of me, and asked, "Is it him?" She replied timidly, and I almost broke my neck from nodding so vigorously in confirmation. Without hesitation, he grabbed the guy by the arm and pulled him off the bus, practically throwing him onto the sidewalk. Before closing the doors, he made it clear, "If I weren't at work, each of your fingers would be broken, understand?" And everyone here would applaud, because no one in the world defends a sick person who goes around touching young girls. So before you even think about doing that again, you remember me and how alone and insignificant you're feeling right now. And pray that I never see you again in this life, because I'm not done with people like you. As soon as Uncle Rick returned to his seat, everyone on the bus applauded. The next day, we brought him lunch as a token of gratitude. Interestingly, we saw that guy again, but only through the bus window. We discovered that the route passed right in front of his house, but after Uncle Rick's promises, he was forced to take a different bus with a stop that was a 45-minute walk from his house. 19 years later, I still feel the need to keep my back against something secure whenever possible. After that experience, Uncle Rick managed to restore a bit of my confidence in bus drivers. So a special thanks to all the Uncle Ricks out there who protect children from monsters when they still can't defend themselves. Something quite frightening happened to me yesterday, and I'm still trying to understand it all. Good heavens, I'll start with a bit of context. I live in Scotland, a country that is generally quite peaceful. Recently, I moved from Edinburgh to Glasgow, going to the eastern side of the city. I know this area is considered more dangerous, but it's not nearly as bad as some might think. I live with my family on the outskirts of the city, in a more rural region. Around here, the landscapes are dominated by houses and farms, with no shops or stations nearby. Although there are several houses in the neighborhood, they're quite far from each other, separated by large gardens. There are no sidewalks, and the road is narrow and worn, with cars rarely seen there, making it peaceful to walk around. I have a habit of taking a daily run of about 1.5 miles, usually around 6 in the evening. But yesterday, I needed to study and ended up going for my run only around 9 at night, when it was already quite dark. I'll describe the scene for you. To the left of the road was a house with the lights on, and to the right a field or farm. Further ahead, you would pass an abandoned building, and then an area with trees for about 600 feet. That was the look of the road, not completely isolated, but scary enough to make me uneasy at that time of night. As usual, I put on my headphones and turned up the volume of the music, barely hearing anything around me. When I entered the stretch with trees, it was really dark, and the street lights were flickering, failing to illuminate the path. I ended up turning on my flashlight to guide me, while a song from Les Miserables played in my headphones. That's when I noticed the lights flickering again, and I even felt a bit of relief. But then I saw it, a figure standing about 90 feet away, maybe 60 feet into the middle of the trees. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. But no, he was there, completely motionless, not moving at all. It sent a chill down my spine, and I continued running without looking back. I lowered the volume of the music just as a precaution, to be able to hear any movement from the figure if I needed to run. I sped up and passed by it, still with the volume low. When I had distanced myself about 300 feet, I turned the music back up and tried to process what had just happened. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me because of the darkness. Now I was far away, but I knew I would have to go back home, which meant I would have to pass by that place again. This time the lights were flickering, but remained on most of the time. I tried to stay alert to the spot where I had seen the figure before, but I couldn't see anything there anymore. Still, I remained frightened. I turned off the music and started running faster through that stretch, driven by fear. That's when, suddenly, a man jumped out from the other side of the road, right in front of me. It seemed to be the same figure. I stood frozen for a second, shocked, until he started to move. I turned and ran as fast as I could. As I fled, He started screaming for help, literally yelling at the top of his lungs while coming after me. I finally passed the tree area and reached the part with the houses. Someone heard me screaming and came out to see if I was okay. I stopped running and realized that the man had disappeared. I told what happened to the person who came to help me. At that moment, I was completely terrified. I still needed to get back home, but my parents weren't there. They had gone to friend's house, leaving me alone. So I asked the stranger for a ride, because I didn't want to pass by that place again. Fortunately, the person was very helpful and took me home safely. Upon arrival, I locked all the doors and checked everything to make sure I was secure. Shortly after, my parents arrived, but I preferred not to tell them anything to avoid worrying them. Today, I didn't go out for a run because I'm really scared. I'm terrified just thinking about what could have happened if I had been too tired to run and he had caught up to me. I'll keep you updated if anything else happens, although I pray that nothing else does. I grew up with my father and brother after my mother passed away when I was 9. At the time of this story, I was 13 and my brother was 16. He used to go out with friends, and I also spent a lot of time away from home, drinking in the park with friends until late at night. My father was an alcoholic and usually too drunk to notice if I was home or not, which gave me complete freedom without any rules or limits. My father would often bring home people who also dealt with alcoholism or used drugs. Many times when I returned home, I would find them passed out or sleeping from drinking too much, not noticing that I had arrived, and I would go straight to my room. One night, I came back from hanging out with friends in the early hours of the morning. I passed through the living room on my way to my bedroom and saw my father asleep in the armchair. A man he had brought home was there too. He must have been around 50, and I didn't recognize him. He looked at me strangely, smiled, and tried to make conversation. But I was anxious to go straight to my room. I changed clothes, putting on my pajamas, and was heading to the bathroom. On the way, I heard his voice. "You look pretty in those pajamas," he said with a smile that scared me. Instead of continuing to the bathroom, I went back to my room and closed the door behind me. My room had a lock, and I didn't hesitate to use it. Soon after, I heard him trying to open the door. I was terrified, realizing his intentions weren't good. I pushed the bed against the door to block the entrance in case he tried to break in. He started banging on the door. "I just want to say hello. Don't be so rude. Open the door." I remained silent in panic, not knowing what might happen next. I was a smart 13-year-old girl, and at that moment, I knew I was in danger. With the bed blocking the door and the lock engaged, I could still hear the man pushing from the other side, trying to get in. I opened my bedroom window and screamed for help with all the strength in my lungs. "Help, please." Later, I found out that my neighbor heard my screams. Knowing the constant state of drunkenness of my father, he imagined something serious had happened. He came to our house, probably saw my father sleeping, and then went up to my room, knocking on the door. I could hear his voice, which gave me a sense of security. Despite trusting him, I was so shaken that I could barely move. I was huddled in the corner of the room, crying, trembling, and overwhelmed by panic. With effort, He managed to open the door by pushing against the weight of the bed and entered to see if I was okay, believing that I might be injured. He simply hugged me while I tried to compose myself and explain what had happened. The man who caused all this had already gone, but the feeling that he could return at any moment tormented me, especially because my father was never sober enough to understand what I had to say. This was the last straw for social services, and that same night I was placed in the foster care system. I spent several nights unable to sleep properly, afraid that man would appear at my house or at one of my friends' houses. After that, we all avoided going back to that place. Today, as an adult, I find myself wondering, was it just someone trying to scare me? Someone with darker intentions? I'll never know, and maybe that's for the best. I'm still struggling to put into words one of the most disturbing experiences of my life, even though it's been almost 2 years since it happened. Bear with me as I try to share this story. I haven't written anything this lengthy since my college days. My best friend and I decided to go hiking one cold spring morning in northern Minnesota. The weather was far from ideal, chilly and raining. But I've always loved the rain, and the way it brings out the deep green of pine needles has always captivated me. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and we figured there wouldn't be many people around since most would be at work during that time. We chose a trail that looked interesting at Boundary Waters State Park and drove about 50 minutes to get there. When we arrived, our excitement grew instantly. There were no other cars in the parking lot, which meant we'd have the forest to ourselves. Due to the weather and it being a weekday, we hadn't expected it to be so deserted. But the idea of exploring that space with no one else around seemed incredible. We could hardly wait to begin. Just a few minutes after we started walking, my friend noticed something strange. I hadn't seen anything, but he was looking between the trees as if he'd spotted someone or something. "What is it?" I asked. He pointed about 20 feet ahead and said, "Right there. Tell me that doesn't look like a face staring at us." It took me several seconds, but I eventually saw what he meant. It was odd. It did resemble a human face. We decided to continue along the trail, since whatever it was remained motionless. I told him it was probably just some kind of optical illusion. Nature plays tricks like that sometimes. When we got closer, we could see what it was, a mask nailed to a tree. It wasn't exactly on the main path, so if you hadn't spotted it beforehand, you might never have noticed it. The mask blended well with the tree, surrounded by branches and the few remaining patches of lichen. We approached for a closer look, because the scene was too strange to ignore. It was one of those simple plastic masks you can find almost anywhere, the kind children wear for Halloween. We took a photo of it, finding the discovery curious. Then my friend decided to take the mask. I asked him not to, just as a precaution. What if it was part of some forest park Halloween event or something? He didn't pay much attention to my concerns and yanked the mask from the tree. Inside, he found a note. We decided to open and read it. The paper said, "Go behind this tree and continue walking until you find number 2. I immediately thought it must be some activity organized by the park rangers, but my friend didn't think so, and thinking about it now, he was right. The mask was well off the trail. It wouldn't make sense if it were meant for children, because they wouldn't encourage anyone to stray so far from the path. I suggested we leave it alone and continue our hike, especially since the rain was getting heavier. But he was curious and wanted to investigate if there was anything else where the note indicated. Ignoring my suggestion, he followed the instructions and continued walking behind the tree. It wasn't exactly close, but after about 50 or 60 feet into the dense underbrush, we found another mask, this time nearly covered by earth and pine needles. My friend lifted it up, and as we expected, we found another cryptic message equally vague. To summarize, the sequence repeated itself 3 more times, totaling 5 masks. When we reached the final mask, the note simply said, "See you soon." That gave us chills, but we ended up laughing it off, perhaps to ease the tension of the strange situation. At that moment, I thought I was just being paranoid, but I swear I could hear sounds echoing around us in the forest. I decided to ignore this feeling and continue forward with him, despite my discomfort. After a few hours, we returned to the car and were surprised to see another vehicle in the parking lot. It was parked right next to mine, so close that I had to move my car forward so my friend could open the door and get in. During the drive back, we talked about the masks and concluded it must have been an elaborate prank, perhaps even an event. After all, at that time of year, it's not uncommon for someone to try to give you a scare, you know. I dropped my friend off at his house and then headed to mine. What I didn't know was that in just a few hours, the most terrifying night of my life was about to begin. After watching a basketball game on TV, I started to get ready for bed. It must have been around 11:30, if I had to guess. It's worth mentioning that at the time, I lived alone in a small house near the edge of town. While I was in the bathroom, I heard something from outside. Normally, I wouldn't bother looking, but that night, for some reason, I felt compelled to check, and I still can't believe what I saw. On my front lawn stood 5 people wearing masks, exactly like the ones we had found on our hike earlier that day. I peeked through the living room window first. When I saw those figures, I ran to the bedroom and immediately called the police. The 10-minute wait was undoubtedly the longest of my life. Their behavior was bizarre, to say the least. They seemed to be dancing, moving in a strange way as if they were celebrating something. Every now and then, they would run up to my front door, repeatedly ring the doorbell, and then return to the yard to continue their unsettling movements. Part of me was still trying to believe it was all just an elaborate prank, but honestly, it had gone way too far. In the last few minutes before the police arrived, they started to become more aggressive. Instead of just ringing the doorbell, they began banging on the door, not just with their hands, but with their entire bodies. The main entrance was just below my bedroom, and I could feel the vibrations rising through the walls with each impact. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the lights of police cars approaching. As soon as the masked figures noticed, they scattered in various directions. 2 officers tried to chase them, but they returned after a minute or 2 without success. I talked with another officer and gave my statement, but the situation didn't progress much. The police never managed to catch or identify anyone, and since there was no evidence of breaking and entering, they told me there wasn't much they could do, and that I should call again if they showed up a second time. I was frustrated, of course, but what more could I do? The next day, I installed a Ring camera at my front door, and to this day, 2 years later, they've never returned. I've convinced myself it was just a cruel prank, and that's the only reason I can still sleep peacefully. Whether it was really just a prank or something worse, I still have no idea. When I remember the sound of them hitting the door with their bodies, it's hard to believe it was just that. I just truly hope they never come back. I've always hated the idea of hiking and venturing into nature. I'm not exactly a fan of the natural environment, and I admit without shame that I'm somewhat of a snob. I despise excessive heat, and honestly, the cold doesn't appeal to me either. My friends even nicknamed me Goldilocks, because they say everything has to be just right for me not to make a scene. Well, they're not wrong. But hiking, that's the worst of all, and I have my reasons, believe me. Years ago, I was dating a man named Marcus, with whom I was deeply in love. He was one of those adventurous types who loved the outdoors. And even though it took me a while, I eventually gave in and started participating in the activities he enjoyed. I admit, albeit reluctantly, that I began to like some of the easier trails, the kind that a real hiker would probably scoff at. These trails were perfect for me. A few hours outdoors, nothing too exhausting, and the best part was returning home to sleep in my own bed. About a year into our relationship, Marcus insisted we go on a hiking trip for his birthday. I agreed because, as I said, I was already getting used to these outdoor activities. I was a bit apprehensive because his birthday fell in early February, which meant a risk of cold weather. And in case it wasn't clear before, I absolutely hate the cold. Marcus reassured me that it would be an easy trail and that the weather wouldn't be too bad. But he was wrong. When the day arrived, the weather was terrible. The fog was so thick you could barely see, and there was an uncomfortable mix of sleet and snow. I was absolutely miserable. Still, we went ahead with the hike because I was trying to be a good girlfriend, you understand. But a bit too late, I realized this wasn't an easy trail. Marcus was clearly trying to push me beyond my limits, and I was furious. We were on a narrow path when my foot got caught on something, causing me to fall. And it wasn't just any fall. I tumbled all the way down a steep ravine like a bowling ball rolling downhill. The pain was excruciating, and I was certain my leg was broken. I panicked, not knowing what to do. I could hear Marcus shouting from above, but I couldn't respond right away. After some time, I finally shouted back, explaining what had happened. I was relieved to be alive, and he told me to stay where I was while he went for help, as if I had any other option besides staying put. The pain was unbearable and seemed to increase with each passing minute. It didn't take long for me to realize we were quite far along the trail. It would take time for him to return, find cell service to call for help, and then somehow someone would need to reach me. I started crying because the situation seemed impossible from where I lay. Since my fall, the most I'd managed to do was drag myself to a tree and lean against it. My watch had broken during the fall, so I had no idea how much time had passed. It felt like hours had gone by, and since it was early February, the sun started to set. I was getting so cold that I could barely feel the pain anymore. If you think that sounds bad, Wait until you hear how things got even worse. When it started to get dark, pitch blackness took over quickly. Soon it was almost completely dark. Fortunately, I had a flashlight that I planned to use to illuminate the ravine if I heard anyone coming. That is, if anyone was going to show up. By this point, I was convinced that no one would. As I sat there with the pain throbbing, I began to hear a sound that I wished was just my imagination. It was like a low growl that I could almost feel vibrating around me. I turned on the flashlight, and as I illuminated the area in front of me, I saw two gleaming eyes in the darkness. I turned off the light and began to sob. Whatever it was, whatever eyes I had just seen, belonged to something that most likely represented danger. The growling got closer, and I could feel the vibrations of paws on the ground. Even in the darkness, I could make out what was just a few feet away from me. A massive grizzly bear. I had no idea how to react. I didn't know if it was better to stay still, scream, or raise my arms to appear larger. I ended up deciding to just sit there and let out a silent whimper. In that moment, I accepted that I might die. The pain was already unbearable, and the bear was so close that I could feel its breath graze my face. The smell of its breath was intense, mixed with the sound of its growling. I kept my eyes closed, ready for whatever came next. Many people talk about frightening situations they've faced, but I can guarantee few things compare to being trapped at the bottom of a ravine at night with a broken leg and a bear almost on top of you. The bear remained there for several minutes until its growling transformed into heavy breathing. It sat down, panting, just a few inches away from me. I tried to imagine it was just a giant dog there beside me, but that didn't help at all. Then, after some time, it stood up and walked away. I heard its footsteps receding and finally managed to let out a sigh of relief. Soon after, I heard a faint voice coming from the top of the ravine. I pointed my flashlight at the rocky wall. They had gone a bit too far, but soon returned to the point where I had fallen and illuminated the area with powerful spotlights. Two men rappelled down, and the scene looked like something out of a movie. The following hours were anything but easy. They put an improvised splint on my leg, rigged up an improvised pulley system, and began pulling me up the side of the ravine. Each inch gained was pain that seemed impossible to bear. But eventually, I made it out of that forest and was taken to the hospital, where they confirmed the fracture in my leg. It didn't take long for me to break up with Marcus. I decided right there in the hospital that my relationship with outdoor activities had come to an end. I had my encounter with death, and that was enough. To this day, I don't understand why that bear essentially ignored me. Maybe it was pity. I'm grateful to be alive to tell this story and to leave a first-hand warning. If you don't feel capable of completing a trail, respect your limits and give up. Your luck may not be the same as mine. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.